Somewhere out there, on a couch, in a car, under the covers, you're watching this. Or maybe it's 2:43 in the morning, and you're half asleep, half scrolling, looking for something calm enough to let your brain drift, but interesting enough to hold on to a little longer. Well, if you've landed here, you're in the right place. Go ahead, dim the lights, turn your screen brightness down, let the modern world dissolve just a little, because tonight, we're going somewhere older than mattresses, older than bedtime, older than dreams with clocks in them. This is the quiet corner of the internet, where we tell stories the way they were meant to be told. Slowly, symbolically, and with just enough mystery to leave your brain humming in the background. If you like long stories about early humans, sleep rituals, ancient instincts, and the strange magic of firelight, you just might have found your new nighttime ritual. So if you'd like to support more storytelling for tired sapiens like us, liking or subscribing is quietly appreciated. No panic, no algorithms, just you, me, and a story. If you feel like commenting, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's always interesting to see who else is awake in the deep hours of human time. Now, let's begin. Imagine this. You wake up before the light touches the trees. Not because of an alarm, not because your dog stepped on your face, not because you fell asleep on the couch and now your shoulder is screaming. You wake up because the air in your shelter has shifted. The fire beside you has burned low, just soft orange embers now. Cold air is whispering through the branches and hides overhead. You reach out half asleep to feed the coals a little bark and dried grass. It's not a crisis, it's just morning, and the world is waiting. There are no emails, there is no ceiling, just the sounds of insects and wind. You pull the fur over your shoulder, turn, and doze again. This wasn't a rare camping trip. This was life for tens of thousands of years. For our ancestors, sleeping wasn't an afterthought squeezed in between blue light and stress dreams. It was the core of survival. The way they slept shaped everything. Their health, their communities, their minds. And what's wild is, they were good at it, like really good. In fact, if there were Olympic medals for restorative, instinct-aligned, stress-free sleep, the cavemen probably would have taken gold every time. And here we are, thousands of years later, staring at little rectangles, wondering why we're so tired. But we'll get into that. First, let's meet the night, not our night, with LED streetlights and playlists and electric blankets. Their night, the Paleolithic dark. It's around 20,000 years ago, somewhere in what we now call northern Spain. There's a cluster of small shelters tucked near the mouth of a cave, thin animal hides stretched over bent branches, surrounded by stones. A group of humans, maybe 25 people, have gathered. There's a fire burning low in the center, and they're lying in a loose circle around it. Backs to the cold, faces to the warmth. Sleep doesn't come all at once. It drifts in, slowly like fog. Someone hums. Someone scratches at the dirt. The children settle first. The adults take longer, because they're listening. For wind, for footsteps, for anything strange. Caveman's sleep wasn't what we'd call 8 uninterrupted hours. And that's the first thing we need to throw out. That clean block of sleep we all chase. It's actually weirdly modern. For most of human history, sleep came in phases. 2 long stretches with a little pause in between. Something researchers now call segmented sleep. People would doze off after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake naturally around midnight, then talk, tend the fire, snack, maybe even tell stories, and fall back asleep for the second round. That quiet gap in the middle wasn't insomnia. It was normal. It was built in. And honestly, it sounds kind of magical. You didn't need a weighted blanket to feel safe. You had the body heat of your people, the crackle of a fire that never died out, and the knowledge that someone was awake, watching the dark while you rested. Security wasn't digital, it was communal. One pair of eyes scanning the tree line while others snored softly. And that vigilance wasn't just paranoia, it was smart. There were animals out there, weather, other bands of humans. Sleep was light for a reason, and that didn't make it worse. It made it safer, more responsive, more tuned to reality. They weren't sleeping through alarms. They were sleeping through instincts. Now picture this. It's late autumn in the Levant, near a slow-moving river. The air smells like moss and wet bark. A small group of early humans, maybe not even Homo sapiens, maybe Neanderthals, have built a sleeping circle under a canopy of low trees. They didn't have pillows, but they used bundles of soft grass, feathers, even fur piled into shallow impressions in the ground. Archaeologists have actually found these spots, depressions in cave floors, or dirt lined with traces of ancient bedding. Some even had insect-repelling plants mixed in. So yes, cavemen basically made their own prehistoric bug spray mattresses. And here's something fun. They didn't sleep alone. Not just with their own group, either. Sometimes humans and animals shared sleeping spaces. Dogs weren't pets yet, but wolves were edging in, curious and not yet afraid. Maybe drawn by warmth, maybe by scraps, maybe by something else entirely. And over time, that weird companionship turned into co-sleeping. That's right, the original bed warmer. A half-domesticated wolf with a grudge against the cold. But sleep wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. Maybe even spiritual. The night was a place for dreams, and dreams were taken seriously. There are theories that early humans believed dreams were a kind of travel to other worlds, or messages from the dead. And in the middle of the night, in that quiet space between first sleep and second sleep, maybe that's when the dreaming really started. Maybe someone sat up, eyes wide, and whispered, "I saw the mammoth again." There were no sleep apps, no eye masks, but there was rhythm. The rhythm of firelight and breath and shared silence. There were no morning people or night owls, just people, rotating responsibilities naturally. Some stayed up later, some woke earlier. Some probably drifted in and out like cats, half-lidded and semi-conscious, listening for the wind to change. And even though they slept on the dirt, wrapped in skins, surrounded by uncertainty, they slept well, not because they had perfect conditions, but because their lives were in tune. Their sleep followed the sun. Their bodies followed the seasons. Their minds weren't cluttered with clocks and schedules and screens. They didn't sleep in spite of their lives. They slept because of them. And honestly, that's what we're chasing now, in 100 small ways. We're trying to recreate what they had without even knowing it. Real rest, deep rest, the kind that settles in your bones. But that's just the beginning. Let's stay in that circle for a moment. The one curled around the fire. The embers glow, and just outside their light, the dark breathes. Real dark, not street light through curtains dark, not paused Netflix screen dark. We're talking about a dark that's alive, stretching out over the hills and trees and cliffs, deep and total. It's in this kind of darkness that human sleep truly learned how to settle, because when the sun dropped, there weren't many choices. You didn't stay up late, but that didn't mean the whole group conked out at once, like someone hit a switch. In fact, some of the most fascinating research in recent years looked at hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, like the Hadza of Tanzania. And what scientists found was this. Even through the night, someone in the group was almost always awake. Not by strict plan, not by rota or alarm, just naturally. The young dozed deeper, the old napped lightly, the mothers stirred, the fire tenders stretched. The band flowed through the night in waves, not all at once. And what that meant, and this is beautiful, is that the entire group was almost never fully asleep at the same time, which means they were always protected. A living, breathing night shift before the idea of shifts even existed. It wasn't lonely either. If you stirred in the night, you weren't the only one. You might hear someone humming softly, or cracking bones for marrow, or whispering to a half-asleep child. There was no go back to sleep guilt. That middle of the night wakefulness, it had space. You could talk, think, stare at the stars. Even take a short walk if you were careful. Some anthropologists believe this in-between time, between the two sleep phases, might have been when humans told stories, shared dreams, or made quiet decisions. It's the kind of time we barely have anymore. But they did, and it was natural. Now let's talk about light. Because if you want to understand prehistoric sleep, you have to understand their relationship with light, or more accurately, with the absence of artificial light. See, our brains are wired to take cues from light. Blue light, like the stuff pouring off your phone right now, tells your body to stay awake. Red-orange light, like fire, says, hey, it's okay to rest now. Early humans didn't have iPhones. They had fire. Firelight doesn't mess with your melatonin. It invites it. The flicker of flames literally encouraged your brain to slow down, to release the chemicals that say yes, let go now. That's why sitting around a campfire still makes people sleepy. It's not nostalgia, it's biology. And fire was more than just sleep ambience. It was life insurance. You didn't just build a fire and let it die out. You kept it, fed it, protected it, passed it down. Imagine that someone every night, making sure the flame never went out. Not for romance, for survival. Because starting a fire from scratch, that took time, tools, skill, and if it rained, good luck. So humans became firekeepers. There might be an older woman in the group, whose job it was to stay close to the coals, to wake before everyone and stir the embers. Or maybe a teenage boy who took pride in feeding it just right. Fire was everyone's business because it meant safety, warmth, cooked food, and yes, it meant better sleep. And this fire wasn't just sitting off to the side. It was central. Literally, the shelters were built around it. Picture a tight circle, hides and grass mats closest to the flames, then larger sleeping areas radiating outward. People arranged themselves based on age, roles, closeness, maybe even status. But no one slept far from the heat, and in the flickering shadows, your brain felt something it rarely feels now: secure. You could see who was near you. You could hear breathing, smell smoke, feel warmth. And that told your ancient nervous system, it's okay. You're not alone. You're home. Now here's something weird and beautiful. Even babies, prehistoric babies, probably slept better than we do now, because they weren't sleep trained. They were sleep surrounded. They didn't cry from cribs in separate rooms. They were pressed against their mother's body, wrapped in fur, listening to her heartbeat. When they woke, they weren't checked on. They were already held. It wasn't parenting style. It was instinct. The human infant was, and still is, one of the most vulnerable newborns in the animal kingdom. So our species evolved to meet that vulnerability with proximity. And you better believe that made a difference in sleep. Not deep sleep, maybe, but peaceful sleep. The whole ecosystem of rest worked like that. No alarms. No commuting. No buzzing brain trying to sort emails from arguments. Just a slow slide into the rhythm of dusk, and an equally slow return at dawn. And if you think this sounds romanticized, that's fair, but we've got archaeological receipts. Evidence from ancient sleeping areas shows a clear pattern. Communal bedding spaces, fire residue, carefully placed near depressions in the dirt. Ash layers where embers were buried and kept warm. We even have traces of plants arranged in bedding, some of which had natural insect-repelling properties. That's not random. That's prehistoric aromatherapy. And no, not every night was safe. Not every night was peaceful. There were storms. There were predators. There were nightmares. But even those weren't faced alone. In a small band of humans, everything was shared, including fear, including dreams, including silence. And that silence, that deep, real stars above your head silence, that's the one thing we can barely touch anymore. Most of us have forgotten what true silence feels like, but they knew. They lived in it, slept in it, woke in it. It wrapped them like another blanket, and maybe that's why, when they did dream, the dreams were louder, clearer, maybe even sacred. But more on that later, because there's still so much more to say about how they dealt with nightmares, how dreams became rituals, and how the line between sleeping and waking was blurrier than we might think. There's a moment just before waking, just after sleep, when everything is quiet, but your heart is loud. You know that moment, The edges of a dream still cling to your skin. You're not quite in your body yet. And for a split second, you don't remember who you are, or what year it is, or where you need to be. That moment, early humans lived there a lot longer than we do. Because for them, sleep wasn't a blackout. It wasn't a switch flipped off at night and back on at sunrise. It was a state like mist on water, where consciousness and memory, fear and story, survival and meaning, all swirled together. They didn't just fall asleep. They entered something. And inside that, something were dreams. Now, it's hard to say what early humans dreamed of. They left us no journals. But they left signs in ochre, in bone, in carvings on cave walls that stretch back 30,000 years. Paintings so vivid they still pull breath from modern lungs. Animals in motion, spirals, hands, shapes that seem to move when the torchlight flickers. These were not decorations. These were experiences made visible, and many researchers, even the cautious ones, believe they came from dreams, or trances, or visions sparked by the deepest sleep and the deepest dark, because dreams back then weren't something you forgot by breakfast. They were messages from the ancestors, from the animals, from the spirit world, and sometimes from your own mind, wrestling with the day. Imagine this. A man wakes just before dawn, sweating. His breath is tight. In his dream, a lion was standing over him, not attacking, just staring. When he rises, he doesn't shrug it off. He tells the others, not for comfort, for warning, for meaning. Because maybe that lion wasn't a dream. Maybe it was a sign. Or maybe the lion was real, and his body attuned to sound in ways we've long dulled. Heard a growl in his sleep and turned it into a dream. That's the thing. The line was thin, and that thinness mattered, because sleep, for early humans, wasn't always gentle. It was vulnerable, and sometimes terrifying. Night was when predators moved, when the cold crept in, when the shadows changed shape, and so their sleep had to be alert. Their dreams had to be informative. You could say they were constantly sleeping with one eye open, but that would miss the point. It wasn't fear that kept them half aware. It was wisdom, a kind of body knowledge we've mostly lost. The wisdom to stay soft, but not unaware, open, but not exposed. And here's something fascinating. In groups that still live traditionally today, like the San people of southern Africa, dreams are shared, discussed, treated as social events. If someone dreams of danger, the group listens. If someone dreams of ancestors, they pay attention. It's not superstition, it's memory wrapped in metaphor. And it's probably how our own ancestors used dreams too, not as private puzzles, but as community information, a shared subconscious. Now, not all dreams were scary. Some were erotic, some were funny, some were nonsense. But even nonsense meant something. If a child said, "I dreamed of a black bird flying over the fire," no one told them to forget it. They might be told a story instead of the first bird, the bird that brought flame, the one whose feathers caught fire and turned night into day. Because again, this was a world with no written language. Story was survival. Dream was story's cousin. And some dreams didn't end when you woke up. Let's go back 15,000 years ago to the hills of modern-day France. In a cave now called Les Trois Frères, there are paintings so unusual, some scholars believe. They depict shamans, humans in animal skins, antlers, hooves, half man, half beast. Not just artists, dreamers who brought visions back from the other side of sleep. We'll never know for sure, but the energy is there. These were people who believed the night was not just rest, it was a crossing, and there were rituals. Maybe not the kind we think of, robes, incense, incantations, but smaller ones, personal ones. Someone might always sleep closest to the fire. Someone else might carry a small carved figure, worn smooth from handling at night. Some groups buried the ashes of a fire in a specific way. or placed charms near the entrance of their shelter. Against spirits, against animals, or just because it felt right. The line between belief and instinct gets blurry. But it tells us one thing: they didn't just sleep in the dark. They lived with it, which brings us to something we rarely talk about. What if early humans weren't just better sleepers, but braver ones? Because to sleep, really sleep, in an open shelter, with no doors, no locks, no flashlight, no walls, just thin hide and warm breath, and a fading fire, that takes a kind of trust most of us don't even realize we've lost. Trust in your group, trust in your instincts, trust in the rhythm of the world not to betray you. And sure, some nights were restless. Some were broken by hunger, weather, fear. But others were perfect. Cool air, warm bodies, steady breathing, flickering flame, stars overhead. Those were the nights you woke and felt peace in your bones. Not because of a sound machine, not because of blackout curtains, just because everything for once was still. And in the morning, you wouldn't rush, you wouldn't scroll. You'd open your eyes slowly, smell the ash, hear the birds, feel someone else stirring beside you, and you'd remember your dream, not as fiction, but as part of the night's work. Maybe you'd tell it, maybe you wouldn't. But either way, it would stay with you, like a stone in your pocket, like a gift. So yes, cavemen had the best sleep in history. And now, we've barely scratched the surface. So far, we've sat beside the fire, under stars, in shadows, tucked close to the people we trust. But let's not pretend every night in early human history looked the same. Our ancestors didn't live in just one kind of place. They slept in forests, deserts, tundras, caves, swamps, mountain valleys, and coastlines, and each of those landscapes shaped how the body rested. Because sleeping like a human isn't just about what you lie on, it's about where you are, and what that place asks of you. Let's start somewhere cold. Not just open a window and grab a sweater cold, but deep, biting, world-swallowing cold. We're in Central Europe. The last glacial maximum is holding the region in its frozen grip. Ice sheets cover vast sections of the north. The people here, likely Homo sapiens and their cousins, the Neanderthals, didn't sleep in caves just because they liked them. They used them for insulation, for protection from the wind. And even then, they weren't just curling up in corners and hoping for the best. They built spaces. Picture this: mammoth bones arranged into a semicircle, reinforced with tusks and large stones. Over that, animal hides are stretched tight, stitched together with sinew and fat. Inside, there's grass layered with dry moss and fur to make the ground sleepable. This isn't a fluke, it's construction. And in the middle, you guessed it, a hearth. Ashes from last night's fire, still warm under the coals. The Neanderthals didn't just crash wherever, they made homes. And those homes held the night back, just enough to let them rest. Now go south, the edge of the Sahara. Different challenges entirely. Not cold, but heat. Not predators, but insects. Here, the shelters change. Low woven structures, semi-open, with airflow designed to keep things bearable at night. Fires still burn, but smaller, sometimes smoldering piles of herbs to ward off mosquitoes. Sleeping is done on raised platforms made from wood or reeds, anything to stay above the scuttling life that owns the sand after sunset. In the rainforest, it's different again. Sound doesn't die here at night, it wakes up. Frogs, birds, insects, all screaming into the humidity like it's a contest. You don't get silence. You get a wall of noise that somehow becomes its own kind of lullaby. Humans here build hammocks, stringing them between trees, high enough to avoid snakes, low enough to feel the ground's protection. There's always smoke drifting, not to warm the air, but to push the mosquitoes back. And sleep is lighter, more alert. You don't sink too deep, not when the jungle breathes around you like a living thing. And then there's high elevation. Think of the early inhabitants of the Ethiopian highlands or the Tibetan plateau. Thin air, colder nights. The fires burn longer here, and people sleep closer together. Huddling isn't just comforting, it's required. You share breath, you share heat. In some groups, even in modern pre-industrial societies, people sleep nose to nose, curled like a closed circle. There's less tossing, less turning. Movement wakes others, and in that way, stillness becomes a kind of collective agreement. But no matter the landscape, desert, forest, glacier, grassland, one thing remains. Humans adapt sleep to the land, not the other way around. You didn't have a bedtime, you had a night, and that night shaped how you rested. That adaptability wasn't just physical, it was mental. If you were born near the sea, you probably fell asleep to the rhythm of waves. If you lived in a dry canyon, you listened to wind cut across the rock, and over time, those sounds became your lullabies. The way we think of white noise machines now, nature had the original soundtrack, and early humans didn't block it out. They leaned into it. They learned what sounds meant safety, and what sounds meant get up now. And here's a little twist. Sometimes, humans didn't sleep through the night at all. In hotter regions, some groups are believed to have taken multiple naps throughout the day. A core rest after sundown, a shorter one after lunch, siestas. In other words, were not invented by Mediterranean grandmothers. They're older than agriculture. When the sun gets too high and your body starts dragging, it's not laziness, it's memory. An echo of sleep rhythms baked into our blood, even inside caves. Humans adjusted to the landscape. They didn't all pile into the back like bats. They often stayed near the mouth, where light could still touch them in the morning, and where smoke could escape without choking them out. The deepest caves, the ones with the paintings, weren't always lived in. They may have been reserved for ceremony, for vision, maybe for dreaming with purpose, a sleep pilgrimage. And no matter how different the setting, one thing remained the same. Sleep wasn't privatized. There were no bedrooms, no closing the door behind you. Rest was public, collective, shared. Everyone saw how you slept. Everyone heard it. Snoring, probably accepted. Teeth grinding. Someone would know. No secrets in sleep. And that meant safety, because someone would notice if something was wrong. If you were breathing too shallow, if you thrashed, if you didn't wake when the fire got low. Compare that to now. Doors closed, fans on, white noise cranked up, and most of us sleeping alone, even when we're partnered. There's comfort in solitude, sure, but back then, solitude meant risk. Sleep meant trust. And the group's rest was as much about each other as it was about themselves. So when we talk about the best sleep in history, we're not just talking about REM cycles or pillow softness. We're talking about something deeper. Something we don't even have a word for anymore. The kind of rest that arises when your body fits the land, your breath matches the wind, and you fall asleep truly knowing that someone else is watching the dark while you dream. And maybe that's why, even now, so many of us fall asleep better near someone. Even if we don't say it, even if we've forgotten why. Our nervous systems remember, and if you listen closely, they'll tell you. The sun has dropped behind the trees. The sky is no longer blue, not dark either, but that in-between color that has no name. The insects have started up. The fire is cracking softly, and across the clearing, you can hear the quiet rustle of people settling down. Not all at once, but slowly, with intention. Because in the Paleolithic world, sleep didn't just happen. You prepared for it. There were no schedules, no evening routines in the modern sense, no step-by-step guides, no wind-down playlists. But there was rhythm, and people followed it without question, because the body, when left alone, knows how to descend. It knows what dusk means. It knows what warmth is for. The first thing always was the fire, the central act of nighttime. It had to be built if it wasn't already going, or fed if it was burning low. Ash scraped to the side, new fuel laid carefully, not too much. Fire isn't rushed, it's coaxed. There might be a rhythm to it, someone humming, someone tapping two stones absently while the flames rise. The smoke curls upward and carries the day with it. Next came the camp, the shelter itself. Not cleaning in the way we think of it, but small adjustments. Mats shaken out, stones cleared, leaves brushed aside. Maybe someone rearranged a bundle of furs so they wouldn't roll off in the night. Someone else checked the roof for sagging branches. These were light, instinctive gestures, not chores, not burdens, just habits passed down, not with words, but with hands. You saw your mother tuck the skin tighter around the entrance. So you did it too, because that's what people do before they sleep. And then food. Not always, not every night. But when there was something to share, it was shared then. Dried roots, roasted tubers, maybe a few scraps of meat, if the hunt had gone well. No plates, no order. Just hands passing food between hands. It was warm, communal, slow. No one talked much, not because it was forbidden, but because the world itself was winding down, and the group moved with it. Then came grooming. Yes, really. We don't talk about it much, but early humans, the ones we like to call cavemen, as if they were clueless, cared for their bodies. They picked burrs from hair. They combed fingers through tangles. They rubbed ash or clay on their skin to keep insects off. Some groups even chewed certain plants that cleaned the teeth. There were no mirrors, but there was attention, a kind of self-respect woven into the rhythm of sleep. And of course, the children. If they weren't already curled up beside someone, they'd be scooped closer, tucked under a fur, hair smoothed back. The kinds of things you'd recognize instantly, even now. A quiet she, a palm on the back, a small sound to say, "I'm here." Because even in a world without strollers or screens or schools, children were still children, and sleep was still something you helped them into. One breath at a time. Some people might have stayed up a bit longer. The fire tenders, the watchers, they'd sit near the edge of the light, eyes half shut, listening. Not just for danger, but for anything, an animal, a shift in the wind, a dreamer stirring. And sometimes they'd talk, low and slow, voices just above the fire crackle, not conversation, exactly. More like thinking out loud, and if you were half asleep nearby, you might drift off to those sounds. Familiar voices, familiar words, and the scent of smoke on everything. Other times, there was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone is tired in the same way. Not exhausted, not burnt out, just ready. Muscles soft, eyes heavy. No need to explain it. And even in that silence, the world kept moving. The trees creaked, the animals called out, water ran, the moon slipped through the sky. But inside the camp, under hide and fur, people lay down, not just to sleep, but to surrender, to be carried into something older than language, to enter the space where dreams lived and ancestors waited. It wasn't all comfort. Sometimes the ground was hard. Sometimes the air was cold. Sometimes your shoulder ached, or the baby cried, or a fox shrieked somewhere far too close. But those moments didn't cancel the rest. They were part of it. Interruptions that didn't feel like failures. No one was aiming for perfection. Just enough warmth, just enough quiet, just enough trust to let go. And over time, all those little moments, the brushing of mats, the feeding of fire, the grooming, the stories, the soft corrections, they added up to something, a system. Not one you could diagram, not one anyone invented, but one that worked, night after night, generation after generation. Even the body recognized it. Cortisol dropped, melatonin rose, the fire's flicker mimicked the setting sun, and the pine smoke calmed the nerves. And so the body did what it was meant to do. It rested, fully, gently, without force. We tend to think of progress as a straight line, and it's true. We've invented incredible things. Mattresses, medicine, sleep masks with built-in speakers. But sometimes I wonder if we lost something too. Not because we're doing it wrong now, but because they, without realizing it, were doing it so right. They weren't optimizing their sleep. They were living it, letting it be what it was, a return, not a retreat. And that's something we can still learn from. The fire is down to coals now. The camp is still. Somewhere in the back of the shelter, someone's snoring, softly, rhythmically, like a drum you didn't realize was playing. A few murmurs float through the dark. Not language exactly, just the low sounds people make when they shift between sleep and waking. And across the flickering shadows, a child stirs. Not enough to cry, just enough to roll closer. Small hand reaching, eyes not quite open, and beside them, an older woman, maybe a grandmother, doesn't even need to look. She shifts her weight slightly, opens her arm, and the child settles in. Nothing spoken, nothing explained, just something done the way it's always been done. Because sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a place where knowledge lived. Not in books, not in recordings, but in bodies, in proximity, in repetition. The way we learn now, in classrooms, through apps, by Googling, that's new. For most of human history, learning happened by being there. Especially at night. Think about it. The younger ones didn't have bedtime stories. They had stories told into sleep. Not as entertainment, but as culture, as inheritance. Someone, an aunt, an older sibling, a father, would murmur something as the fire popped. A tale about the first rain, about a bird that stole fire, about why we don't step over sleeping people. These weren't fairy tales. They were instructions. They were maps of behavior, told so early and so often that by the time the child understood the words, the rhythm had already settled in their bones. And it wasn't just children listening. Adults listened too, because memory wasn't individual. It was collective. One person might remember how to prepare a specific route, but if they forgot, someone else knew. Knowledge echoed between people, like a song passed down with harmonies added over time. And sleep, that soft, borderless state, was when a lot of it soaked in. There's a reason memory and dreams are so tightly wound. Studies now show that during sleep, especially deep sleep, the brain consolidates information, moving short-term memories into long-term ones. But long before science mapped that out, early humans lived it. They used it. You observed the day. You listened at night. You slept with those impressions in your head. And when you woke, the world made a little more sense. And because sleeping was done communally, always, you didn't just learn with your ears. You learned with your senses. You learned how someone sighed when they were uneasy. You learned the rhythm of breath that meant someone was truly asleep. You learned which movements meant dreaming, which twitches meant waking, which silences meant something was wrong. Even that, the act of simply noticing, was passed down. Imagine this. You're 10 years old, curled beside your older cousin. Every night you feel her shift before the fire gets low. Every night you watch how she adds a piece of bark without waking anyone. You never ask how she knows when to do it. You just know she knows. And slowly, without realizing it, you know too. That's how most things worked. Observation, presence, repetition. And that includes the way people bonded. We tend to think of emotional closeness as something we talk through. But early humans often didn't have that luxury. Language, especially in its earliest forms, was not always precise, so connection happened differently. By touch, by sound, by the simple act of being still next to someone, as night pressed in. When you sleep beside the same people every night, and I mean truly beside them, inches away, hearing their breath, sharing their warmth, you develop a kind of emotional intimacy we rarely talk about. You know each other's rest, and that's powerful. There were no earplugs, no closed doors. If someone thrashed in a nightmare, you felt it. If someone cried in their sleep, you heard it. And over time, those sounds became part of your emotional map, as familiar as someone's face. And the comfort, It didn't come from solving problems. It came from being there. You don't need therapy language when someone simply reaches across the dark and places a hand on your back. Even grief lived here. If someone died, and death came often and young, they were mourned into sleep. Stories would be told at night, not just for the living, but to the dead. Fires would be kept burning longer. Silence would hang heavier, and the empty space where someone used to lie would echo, not just in the body, but in the group's whole sense of rhythm. They didn't hide from it. They let it ache, let it breathe. Because in a world where life was short, sleep was one of the few places you could visit those who had left. And maybe that's why dreams mattered so much. You didn't just miss the dead. You waited for them to show up in your dreams. And when they did, it was a kind of visit, not a haunting, a reunion. All of this emotional depth, this shared memory, this sleep-based education, it didn't require language or screens or structure. It required people, close together, paying attention. And maybe that's what we miss now without even knowing it. We try to replicate it with bedtime routines, with shared stories, with sleep tracking apps. And those things help sometimes. But there's something ancient in us that still remembers the feeling of sleeping next to a whole world of breath and warmth and memory, not just for rest, but for wisdom. That's why, when people say, we don't need to go back to the past, I don't argue, we don't. But sometimes it's worth remembering that the past didn't go anywhere. It lives in us, in the way we settle, in the way we soothe our kids, in the way we tell the same stories, over and over, even when we don't know why. Sleep was never just about sleep. It was about how we became human together. You can learn a lot about people by how they sleep. Who sleeps closest to the fire? Who always ends up at the edge? Who shifts a lot? Who's out like a stone? Even in a world without bedrooms, those little dynamics mattered. Maybe even more than they do now. Because when you sleep together, not just with a partner, but as a group, your relationships aren't built in daylight. They're tested in the quiet hours, in the dark. When words are gone, and what's left is trust. There's no social media, no introductions, no get-to-know-you games. There's just breath, shared space, the knowledge that the person lying behind you could have your back, or break it. And in those conditions, over thousands of years, humans evolved something most animals don't have: cohesion. Not just because it was nice, but because it was necessary. You didn't sleep beside someone unless you believed, on some level, they wouldn't stab you in the middle of the night, and vice versa. That's not drama, that's anthropology. Long before laws and governments and contracts, we had something even more primal: proximity-based trust. If you can fall asleep with someone beside you, night after night, and still wake up safe, that's a bond. And this wasn't just emotional fluff. It shaped our biology. There's strong evidence that early humans developed better social coordination, stronger group memory, and more efficient cooperation, not through war or strategy, but through closeness, through shared environments, through sleeping in circles and hearing each other snore. Think about it. A predator might attack. A rival group might approach. If you all sleep like isolated squirrels in separate trees, you won't respond fast enough. But if you sleep like wolves together, ears open, facing out, your group becomes one organism, one breathing, dreaming, listening whole. That kind of connection doesn't happen in a meeting. It happens over time, quietly, while someone scratches behind their ear, while someone else sighs and turns over, while the firelight dances on the roof and someone begins to hum. Not a song, exactly, but a sound that says, I'm still here. Even conflict, and yes, of course there was conflict, was softened by this structure. If you were angry with someone, chances are you still had to sleep next to them. No storming off to your own apartment, no slamming doors. You just had to deal with it, or live with the awkwardness of shoulder-to-shoulder silence. And weirdly, that worked, because over time the shared needs, warmth, safety, food, rest, outweighed the argument. And in that way, sleep became a quiet conflict resolution system. You can't stay mad forever when your foot is accidentally touching theirs under the fur. Even new members, adopted individuals, travelers, mates from other groups, had to earn their sleep spot. Not by fighting, not by proving themselves in grand gestures, but by showing they could rest, listen, keep the fire, hold their place without disrupting the whole. It's not a flashy test, but it's a very human one. And at the center of all this, again, is fire. Because fire didn't just give warmth, it gave shape to the night. The people nearest the flames were often older or more vulnerable. Children, grandparents, those who needed heat the most, the strong, the hunters, the guards, the teens who liked to stay up too late, slept farther out, not as punishment, as perimeter. It was unsaid, understood. The way families now just know who takes the seat by the door, who gets the middle of the bed, who always wakes first. Social roles weren't printed out. They were embodied, and the night revealed them. You might think this sounds rigid, but it wasn't. There was room for fluidity, for change. People shifted positions depending on season, weather, mood. But the structure, the feeling of belonging to a night circle, remained. And let's talk about that circle, because it wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. All over the world, in cultures ancient and modern, humans gather in circles, around fires, around meals, around ceremonies. It's one of the oldest social shapes we know. Why? Because in a circle, everyone faces each other. Everyone is visible. No head of the table. No hierarchy. Just shared light. Sleeping in a circle meant no one was left out. Even if you were quiet. Even if you were strange. Even if you didn't speak much. If you were inside the ring, you were in. And every night, that ritual reaffirmed the group. No speeches. No formal affirmations. Just bodies settling into their spots. A reminder, through repetition, that you belonged. There was comfort in that, even when comfort was hard to come by. Nights were cold. Predators were real. Illness came fast. But when the circle held, when the fire burned steady, when breath rose and fell in sync, it was enough. That sense of us, of this is who we are, wasn't taught in the daytime. It was learned softly in the dark. Through repetition, through breath, through silence, through the small miracle of waking up every day and finding the same people still beside you. And that's one of the things modern life has tried to replicate. 100 different ways. From group therapy, to team-building retreats, to shared houses and sleepovers and camping trips that feel just a little too good. We are, all of us, still trying to sleep in a circle, even if it's just a metaphor now, because somewhere deep inside, where the instincts still live, we know what it meant. We remember, and memory, especially the oldest kind, has a way of keeping the fire lit. If you ever imagined a caveman just flopping down on bare dirt and calling it a night, it might be time to update that mental picture. Because while early humans didn't have pillows or memory foam or 8-point adjustable mattresses, they were far from uncomfortable. In fact, they were remarkably clever about creating rest spaces. They just didn't call it bedding, they called it survival. Let's start with the ground. Dirt isn't forgiving. It gets cold. It gets damp. It presses into your hips and shoulders. And our ancestors knew that. So they layered, not with plastic tarps or sleeping pads, but with what the land gave them: grasses, leaves, moss, even pine needles. These weren't just tossed into a pile. They were arranged, compressed, changed over time, as people learned what stayed soft and what collapsed after a single night. In a cave in South Africa called Sibudu, archaeologists found traces of ancient bedding, 77,000 years old. Layers of sedge and other plants stacked to create a kind of mattress. Even more interesting, Some of those plants had insect-repelling properties, which means this wasn't just about comfort. It was about practicality, about knowing which leaves kept the bugs away and which ones made your skin itch. And this wasn't a one-time experiment. These bedding layers were renewed, replaced, maintained. In other words, cleaned. Cavemen weren't sleeping in filth. They were managing their sleep environment with an attention to detail that would put some modern people to shame. Now imagine the texture of that bed, the crinkle of dry grass, the softness of layered moss, the faint scent of crushed herbs in the dark. Above you, a hide stretched across a branch frame. Around you, others curled in their own spaces. Quiet and warm. The ground beneath might be hard, but the place itself feels safe. And then there were furs. When an animal was killed, nothing went to waste. The hide became a covering, insulation, sometimes even a blanket. It wasn't plush, but it was warm. It kept the wind out, it trapped body heat, and it smelled like life, like earth and sweat and fire. You didn't need synthetic fabrics. You had mammoth skin. These furs weren't just laid down and forgotten. They were arranged carefully, sometimes stitched, sometimes reinforced with woven plant fibers. People learned how to soften them, how to smoke them so they'd last longer, and how to share them in sleep with the kind of closeness that made winter nights survivable. And as shelters evolved, so did sleeping structures. In some places, early humans built raised platforms, simple wooden frames, lashed together with vines or sinew, topped with grass and hides. These weren't luxury items. They were smart adaptations. Raised beds meant fewer bugs, less moisture, a longer lifespan for your sleeping space. In colder regions, people used heated stones, warmed in the fire, and placed near bedding to hold the heat. In windier climates, they dug shallow depressions into the ground to create micro-shelters, sleeping pits that blocked drafts and collected warmth. In some Ice Age dwellings, researchers found evidence of insulated walls packed with moss and clay. That's right, prehistoric insulation, long before building codes. And while we're at it, they even decorated, not the way we do. No string lights or throw pillows, but small personal items placed near sleeping areas. A carved figurine, a stone with an unusual color, a feather tied with sinew. We can't know exactly what they meant, but they were clearly arranged with intention. Maybe as protection, maybe as ritual, maybe just because someone liked to see it before they closed their eyes. There's something profoundly human about that. The urge to make a space your own, even when space is a mat of woven reeds and the roof is a hide stretched over bones. Even when survival is still the main game. Even then, we make ourselves at home. And while children probably slept beside parents or older relatives, they too had their own micro-territories. A corner of fur, a certain rock tucked under their arm, a habit of sleeping with one knee pulled up. These weren't assigned, they just happened, and everyone noticed. Because sleep wasn't private, remember. It was a group event, and so every movement, every murmur, every ritual became part of the community's shared rhythm. You knew who got cold quickly, who always kicked off their covers, who had trouble falling asleep and needed to hear the fire crackle just right. You knew because you saw it every night for years, and those nightly observations helped keep the group together. They reminded you, without words, that people had patterns, that bodies were predictable, that the people around you, for all their wildness, could be trusted to settle, to sleep, to keep the circle intact. Even in death, some of these sleeping spaces endured. Burials often took place in or near sleeping areas. Some graves were lined with red ochre, symbolic maybe, or just a gesture of care. Some held tools, food, even blankets of woven fibers, as if to say, you'll need this wherever you're going. Even in death, the idea of rest remained sacred. And so the beds of early humans weren't just bundles of grass. They were technologies, expressions of knowledge, markers of care. They represented the evolution of comfort, not just for the body, but for the mind. And every time we curl up with a pillow, fluff our blankets, or slide into clean sheets, we're echoing them, those quiet acts of preparation, the patient layering of rest. They didn't call it sleep hygiene, they called it living, and they were good at it. Sleep doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not the same every night. Not now, and definitely not in the world of early humans. Out there, where everything was determined by the land and the sky, rest had to respond. And if you wanted to survive, really survive, your body needed to know how to sleep with the seasons. Let's start with winter. In places with harsh winters, Northern Europe, parts of Asia, even high-altitude regions near the equator, winter was more than cold. It was defining. Days were short, nights came fast, food was harder to find. The rhythm of everything slowed down, and that included sleep. People slept longer in winter, not by choice, but by instinct. With the sun setting early and nothing to light the camp but a single fire, there was little reason to stay awake long. After a short meal and a few murmured stories, the group would settle into a long rest. Not a coma, they'd still wake, still shift, still keep watch, but the hours stretched. Some anthropologists think early humans may have slept 10, even 11 hours a night in the coldest months. And it wasn't laziness, it was conservation. Less movement meant fewer calories burned. Less exposure meant fewer injuries. Sleep was protection from cold, from predators, from overexertion. And if you stayed still long enough, if the fire was good, if the snow stayed quiet, you might wake to find frost lining the hides, but your body warm. The shelters changed too. In winter, people reinforced them. More layers, thicker walls, sometimes underground or partially sunken structures, dug into the ground to trap heat. In mammoth hunting camps, entire bones were stacked into windbreaks. Animal fat was used to seal gaps. This wasn't just engineering, it was instinct layered with tradition. Sleep had to be protected, or you didn't wake up. Now contrast that with summer. In warmer months, sleep changed. It came later. Not because people were partying, but because the sun didn't set until late. Even in pre-industrial societies, people stay up longer in summer. The air's warm, food is plentiful, energy rises, sleep gets shorter but deeper, and dreams get stranger. In summer, shelters opened, mats were laid near rivers, fires burned low or not at all. People slept more lightly, not out of fear, but because they didn't need the depth of winter rest. And in some places, they napped more during the day. That midday heat, you don't fight it, you go still. Shade becomes sacred. A doze under a tree, a body cooled by the breeze. It's not indulgence, it's survival. And when the group moved, which they often did, following herds or harvests or weather, sleep moved too. New sights meant new sounds, new smells, new sleeping patterns. A rocky ledge might demand tighter sleeping circles. A swampy plain meant staying above ground. A dry canyon echoed too loudly. You might shift the fire, move the camp, adjust your positions. It wasn't chaos, it was fluidity. Early humans weren't locked into one idea of sleep. They adapted. They let the seasons teach them. And the body noticed. Your body, even now, still does. Maybe you felt it, that subtle shift in autumn, when your bed feels a little more inviting, or that strange midsummer restlessness, when your brain just won't settle. That's not just caffeine or stress. That's biology, remembering something old. Even light changed everything. In winter, the absence of sunlight triggered longer melatonin release. You didn't just feel sleepy, you felt slow. And in summer, the abundance of light made the body buzz. That wasn't a modern phenomenon. That's a cycle we inherited. There's even speculation and some evidence that in very ancient times, Humans entered a kind of partial hibernation. Not like bears, exactly, but a slowed-down, energy-saving mode during the hardest months. Less movement, less speaking, less everything. Long sleeps broken only by food, fire, and necessary work. Could this be why so many cultures later on developed winter solstice festivals? A way to remind each other, yes, the dark is long, but it will pass. Food shaped sleep too. When bellies were full, people slept deeper. When food was scarce, rest became lighter, more interrupted. The brain stayed alert. Hunting parties woke earlier. Foraging started before sunrise. And sometimes, hunger shaped dreams. People dreamed of meat, of ripe fruit, of food falling from trees. That wasn't just wishful thinking. That was the mind processing what the body needed most. Even sound changed seasonally. Summer was louder. Bugs, birds, running water. Winter was silent, except for the crackle of fire and the occasional snap of ice. That silence, real silence, may have allowed for deeper sleep, more vivid dreams. It certainly made it easier to hear predators or crying babies. And yes, migration mattered. Humans didn't always stay put. When groups moved, sometimes hundreds of miles over a year, they didn't just walk, they slept. Every few days, a new resting place, a new camp, a new configuration of bodies, fire and shelter. And each time the circle reformed, that constant practice of rebuilding a sleep space from scratch trained the brain to adapt quickly, to recognize safety in new shapes, to accept rest in unfamiliar places. It's one reason humans are still surprisingly good at falling asleep in strange environments. Hotel room, friend's couch, back seat of a car. It takes a minute, but most people can do it. That flexibility, it's ancient. A gift from the ones who slept under trees, in caves, beside rivers, and on endless plains. And through it all, through all the seasons and migrations and changes, one thing stayed the same: the need to rest, to truly let go, to feel the body settle into something older than thought, something that no weather could take away. The wind could howl, the nights could stretch, the insects could swarm, but somewhere, always, there was a group of humans pressing in close, feeding the fire, and falling asleep to the rhythm of the world. Close your eyes, just for a second, and listen. Not to the voice, not even to the words, but to what's underneath. The sound behind the sound, the hiss of air, the distant hum of something electric, a fridge, a fan, maybe traffic, faint and far away. That's our version of night noise. Constant, artificial, inescapable. Now imagine the world before all that. The true night, not dark because the sun set, but because everything went quiet. A kind of silence we don't know anymore. Not dead silence, not absolute, but living silence, filled with real things, honest things, a branch creaking under wind, the shuffle of feet on dry leaves, the low snore of someone beside you, the pop of firewood, a bird crying out once, then nothing. This was the soundscape our ancestors fell asleep to. It shaped them. It shaped us. Because when you live outside or close to it, sound becomes part of your nervous system. It doesn't just enter your ears. It enters your awareness. You hear not just what something is, but what it means. That rustle near the camp, probably the wind, but maybe not. That long, low call far in the distance, a night bird, or something else. You learn to tell the difference, not from books, but from experience, from childhood, from listening over hundreds of nights until your body starts reacting faster than your brain. And that listening, it didn't turn off during sleep. In fact, some of the most fascinating studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups show that nighttime listening was collective. Someone always heard something, even when they were asleep, not because they were anxious, because they were attuned. It wasn't paranoia, it was presence. You might be dreaming, but part of your body, was still curled around the world's pulse. A distant footstep, a sudden hush in the frogs, a change in wind direction. Small things, but enough to wake you, enough to shift the whole camp's energy from resting to ready in seconds. And just as importantly, there were sounds that meant you were safe. The soft breathing of others, the low chatter near the fire, a humming voice winding down into stillness, the occasional grunt of someone turning in their sleep. These weren't distractions, they were anchors. They told you, you're not alone. In fact, there's good reason to believe that humans evolved to sleep better with familiar sounds. The presence of others, the rhythm of a group. When we sleep alone in silence now, it's often described as peaceful, but for thousands of years, that silence might have meant danger, separation, isolation. Real peace came from sound, the right sound, the known sound, and over time, we began to ritualize those sounds. Maybe someone always whistled a few notes before they slept. Maybe someone else cracked their knuckles by the fire, every night, without fail, not because it meant something, but because it became something. A cue, a part of the night's pattern, and children picked up on that too. They didn't need lullabies. The lullaby was already playing in the sound of fire, in the rhythm of voices, in the rise and fall of wind against skin and hide. Some families may have hummed or chanted softly at night. Others told stories. Others just let the world speak. In parts of what is now Australia, some Aboriginal communities use the concept of songlines, sacred routes across the land encoded with music, stories, and history. These songs are sung at night, sometimes during rest, not loudly, just enough to remind the group of who they are, where they are, and what came before. It's not hard to imagine something like that happening 40,000 years ago. A whisper of song as the fire dimmed, marking the day's end with a sound older than language. But not all sounds were comforting. There were real threats. A predator's growl, the snap of a twig too close, the silence that meant something big was nearby. Because even predators knew when to stop making noise. And that's when the listening became action. Someone would sit up, quietly. Another would reach for a stick or stone. No screaming, no panic, just awareness, readiness. The group might shift slightly, bodies angling outward, a circle of ears before a circle of fire. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes it did. But in every case, the ability to listen, to respond without words, kept people alive. You didn't just protect the fire, you protected the silence. You made sure that what filled the night was known, predictable, shared. That's still with us. You can hear it in the way people sleep better when someone else is in the room, in the way we fall asleep faster to the sound of rain or fire crackling on a speaker, in the way children ask to leave the door open, not because they're scared of the dark, but because they're listening for someone, for something, for presence. Even now, the wrong sound will wake you. A click, a voice, a footstep that doesn't match the pattern. And the right sound, it will carry you straight into sleep, like a path laid out just for you. Our ancestors knew that. They didn't have sleep playlists or noise-canceling headphones, but they had the original mix, the forest, the fire, the hum of breath and earth and wind, and they fell asleep, not by tuning out the world, but by joining it. They listened, they responded, and they rested, not in spite of the night's sounds, but because of them. Sleep wasn't just about staying alive. It was also where the future began. That might sound strange, thinking about prehistoric humans planning ahead while lying under hides beside a fire. But that's exactly where planning was born, not in the heat of the hunt, not in the adrenaline of survival, but in the slow, quiet hours after dusk, when the world went still and the mind had time to wander. It's easy to forget that imagination didn't arrive with books or cities. It was there from the beginning, and it showed up most clearly at night. When the tasks were done, the bellies were full, The fire was low, and the only thing left to do was think. Maybe not in words. Maybe not even in clear images, but in patterns, in what-ifs, in the soft rehearsal of tomorrow. Somewhere around 70,000 years ago, humans began to do something no other animal really does. They started thinking symbolically, not just reacting to the world, but imagining different versions of it. And while we don't know the exact moment that shift occurred, it almost certainly took root during the night, because night gave them space, privacy, quiet. It gave the mind permission to detach from the present moment and wander a little. Maybe that's how a new kind of tool was invented, not in the heat of problem solving, but while staring at the glowing coals, half asleep, imagining a sharper edge or a better grip. Maybe someone pictured where the herd would move next, based on a memory from last season, a shape in their mind that arrived uninvited, while they listened to the insects in the dark. Maybe the first woven basket was not a sudden burst of creativity, but the result of 100 small thoughts stitched together during dusk. Threads of bark, rhythm, repetition, and time. Because time moves differently at night. It slows down. Or maybe we slow down, long enough to remember the details we ignored during the day. That broken tree branch, that new patch of roots, that faint sound in the distance. At night, those observations become maps, and maps become plans. Not just what happened, but what will happen next. Planning didn't look like it does now. There were no calendars, no whiteboards, no "we'll meet at noon and discuss migration options." But there was intention, there was memory, and there was imagination. When to leave, where to go, who's getting weaker, who's pregnant, where the water is drying up. That kind of information doesn't just live in brains. It spreads in whispers, in silence, in sleeping bodies, curled into decision. Children picked up on this early, not by being told, but by being included. They heard the pauses. They watched who spoke before sleep. They noticed who asked questions, and who answered with just a nod. Over time, they learned that night wasn't just for resting. It was for aligning, for absorbing the unspoken knowledge that kept the group alive another day. Even dreaming played a role. Dreams weren't private, embarrassing nonsense. They were often discussed, interpreted, even acted upon. If someone dreamt that the herd crossed the river, the group might listen. Not always, not blindly, but seriously. Because sometimes, the subconscious remembered what the conscious mind missed. A scent in the wind, a sound 2 days ago, a gut feeling wrapped in animal skin. They didn't need to call it neuroscience. They just needed to pay attention. And so night after night, season after season, year after year, early humans lay in the dark, half asleep, half awake, quietly building the future, not with blueprints or declarations, but with presence, with the mental stitching together of ideas, sounds, instincts, and stories. A form of dreaming that wasn't just about sleep, but about becoming. Even in a world without hospitals, people got sick. They twisted ankles. They cracked ribs. They developed fevers that burned all night. And somehow they survived. Not always, but often enough to leave behind more than just bones. They left behind signs that others had cared for them, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And in nearly every case, healing happened near the fire, during sleep. Not sleep like sedation, sleep like sanctuary. Because when your body is fighting to recover, rest is everything. And for early humans, that rest wasn't solitary. It was shared. The sick didn't get moved to a different shelter or pushed to the edge of the group. They stayed inside the circle, where the warmth was, where the watchers could keep an eye on their breathing, where the little signs of worsening or easing could be noticed, even in the dark. In Shanidar Cave, a site in modern-day Iraq, archaeologists found the remains of a man who lived over 40,000 years ago. He was severely disabled, crushed bones, a withered arm, partial blindness, and yet he lived to old age. That means someone brought him food, helped him move, watched him sleep, adjusted his position when he couldn't do it himself. It means that care didn't stop when the fire died down. It probably got even more tender. You can almost see it, someone rising in the middle of the night, half awake, to drape a fur more tightly over his body. Another person reaching to feel his forehead, not knowing the word fever, but understanding its heat. These gestures weren't medical procedures. They were instincts, soft touches, small movements, done by firelight, without language, and filled with meaning. And the old, the truly old, were not forgotten. Their sleep was lighter, their bones more fragile, their needs more constant, but they remained in the group, not despite their slowness, but because of their knowledge. An elder might forget names, might doze more often during the day, but when the stories began at night, they remembered details, like which berry not to eat, which path floods in spring, which animal gives no warning before it charges. And so they were listened to, cared for, positioned near the center, not the edges. And when sleep became something final, when someone's breath slowed and didn't return, that too was handled in rest. There was no siren, no declaration, just a silence that passed through the group like wind through grass. Someone would sit up, someone else would rise, quietly, and cover the face. There might be tears, or just stillness, but the grief would be shared in sleep. People would stay close that night. The circle would hold, maybe tighter than usual. Because even then, even in loss, sleep was still the safest place, a place to process, a place to remember, a place where the body could go soft without fear. Children rarely sleep like adults. Even now, they toss, they wriggle, they wake for no reason at all. They babble, they dream out loud, they ask strange questions at 3 a.m. And in the Paleolithic world, they were no different. But the group didn't see this as a disruption. They saw it as part of the rhythm. Just another layer of the night's music. A soft voice, a sudden giggle, a tiny foot kicking someone in the ribs. Children didn't have separate rooms. They didn't have cribs or monitors or white noise machines. What they had was closeness. A parent's arm, a sibling's shoulder, someone's heartbeat to fall asleep against. Their sense of safety wasn't theoretical, it was physical. They didn't need to be told they were secure. They could feel it in breath, in warmth, in the sheer weight of the group around them. Sleep was how they learned the world. Not in dreams, though those mattered too, but in observation. A child lying half awake beside the fire might not speak, but they'd see everything. Who tended the embers, who stood guard, who whispered a story. They absorbed patterns without knowing it, not in the way of school, but in the way of muscle memory, in the way a hand learns the motion of weaving, by watching it 100 times before ever trying. And they ask questions, often at the wrong times. A midnight voice might break the silence. Why do the stars move? Or where did the deer go? And someone sleepy but patient would answer. Not always with facts, sometimes with stories. The stars are walking, they might say. They're finding their way home. It wasn't about getting the answer right. It was about responding, about letting the child know that even at night, even in sleep, they weren't alone in their wonder. Their bodies were small, so they took the warmest spots, closer to the fire, in the crooks of knees and underarms. The group arranged itself around them without fanfare. No one announced, "This is for the children." It was just understood. Their sleep was a kind of priority. Not because they were fragile, but because they were the group's future. Keeping them safe at night wasn't kindness, it was strategy. And when they woke, which they often did, the group adjusted. A quiet hum, a soft lull, a hand placed gently on a small back. No scolding, no urgency, just recognition. You're awake. That's okay. We're still here. Because children weren't separate from the group's sleep. They were part of it. Their movements, their noise, their presence, it shaped how the group rested, how it arranged itself, how it held its own center. The night belonged to everyone. but the children reminded them why they were doing all this in the first place. Not every night was just rest. Some nights carried weight, a different kind of silence, a shift in the wind, a sense that the air had thickened, or that the shadows were listening a little more closely. And in those moments, early humans didn't just sleep. They believed. Not in the way we speak of belief now, not bound in texts or temples, but in something more primal, something felt. Because night wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living force, a being with presence. It arrived each evening with invisible hands, pulling a veil over the world, changing how everything sounded, how everything moved. In that world before lamps, before noise, before electricity hummed through the walls, night was a transformation. The rules softened, the edges blurred, and people didn't just endure it, they participated in it. They entered it. Somewhere deep in a forest, 30,000 years ago, a group has gathered around a fire, not for warmth this time, but for ritual. Someone lies in the center, still, a body, someone they knew, someone who just days ago was sleeping beside them, rising at dawn, laughing over cracked bones and fresh berries. Now the group is silent. They don't look away. They don't cover their faces. They begin to lay things beside her. A carved antler, some ochre, a small woven net. Maybe items she owned. Maybe gifts for where she was going. Maybe nothing more than gestures. But that's what ritual is. A pattern we follow when words stop working. They weren't burying her because they understood the science of decay. They were burying her because it felt right, because death wasn't just disappearance. It was a transition, another kind of sleep, one that didn't end at dawn. And when they placed her in the ground, they didn't do it with finality. They did it with intention. They shaped her body into a position that mirrored rest, curled, arms folded, sometimes even with a stone under the head, not tossed away, tucked in. And when they went back to their sleeping circle that night, they likely didn't sleep the same. The rhythm was off. One space was empty. Someone might have stayed awake longer, staring into the coals. Someone else might have dreamed of her, not metaphorically, but literally, her voice, her shape, a sign. And when they woke, they told the others. Because dreams weren't accidents, they were messages. We don't know exactly what they believed, but we have clues. Burials from 100,000 years ago show care. Patterned symbols, etched into bone and stone. Red ochre, scattered like dust across bodies and cave walls. Paintings of animals, with open mouths and human eyes, hidden deep inside caves no one lived in. Places that could only be entered with firelight. The kind of places you go for ceremony, not shelter. These were not casual doodles. They meant something. They carried something. Maybe guidance, maybe memory, maybe even a way to see the world when your eyes were closed. And then there were the stars. The sky was more than a ceiling. It was a moving story. No names for constellations yet, but recognition. The same star always rising just before the first chill of autumn. The moon getting full and waking the animals. The strange moments when a meteor crossed the sky and left no trace. People noticed. They watched. And maybe they sang, or hummed, or whispered small prayers that weren't called prayers, but carried the same weight. Some cultures today still tell stories of the stars walking across the sky. That idea isn't new. It's remembered. Sleep, in all of this, was not passive. It was participation. When people closed their eyes, they weren't just escaping the day. They were opening the door to another version of reality. A reality where animals spoke, where ancestors visited, where visions could warn or guide. And no one thought it was strange. They just listened. Not every dream was shared, but the ones that stuck, the ones that came with a feeling, or a smell, or a strange coincidence the next day, those were taken seriously. So each night when the fire died down and the breath of the group fell into rhythm, it wasn't just a physical rest, it was a crossing, a drift between worlds. Not far, not forever, but deep enough to bring something back with you. A story, a shape, a quiet understanding you didn't have before. That's what made night sacred. Not fear, not superstition, but the quiet possibility that in sleep, you could touch something larger than yourself and wake up just a little different. Sleep didn't float above the rest of life. It was tied to it. To every fire lit, every root dug, every animal tracked across a frozen hill. For early humans, sleeping patterns weren't dictated by clocks. They were shaped by the work of the day and by what tomorrow demanded. If you were hunting at first light, you slept early. If the berries were ripe and the days long, you pushed sleep back a little, squeezing in a few more hours of sun. Rest wasn't rigid. It was flexible, responsive, and deeply earned. The hunters often slept light, not out of fear, though they had reason to be cautious, but because they needed to move at dawn, or before it. You didn't chase prey in the middle of the day, when the heat was high and your scent carried. You moved at dusk, at dawn, in the cool dark hours, when animals stirred. And that meant getting to sleep earlier than most, or waking quietly while the rest of the group still breathed in unison. Those early risers didn't leave with alarms. They stirred naturally, their bodies already tuned to the rhythm of the land. They rose from their bedding, gathered their spears or slings or nets, and stepped carefully over sleeping legs. A nod from the firekeeper, a shared glance, no words, just quiet understanding. Out into the dark, tracking hoofprints and broken branches. Sleep was lighter in those hours, but no less important. It kept the mind sharp, the body ready, and the gatherers, their rhythm was different. Theirs was a morning task, mostly up with the sun, baskets slung low, walking in small groups with children trailing behind. But during certain seasons, when a plant bloomed only for a few hours, or when mushrooms appeared after a rain, they'd rise early too. Sometimes even before the hunters. Their knowledge of timing was surgical. They knew the land's calendar better than any modern farmer, and that knowledge shaped their sleep. Not with pressure, but with purpose. Not everyone woke early. Some stayed behind. Older members, the injured, mothers with newborns, and even they had roles, tending embers, preparing fibers, cleaning tools, teaching by showing, not by speaking. Their sleep was often interrupted, but not disrespected. The group adapted, the group listened. You could be half asleep with a baby on your chest and still be part of the living structure that kept everyone going. And when the hunters returned, sometimes successful, sometimes not, rest became a ritual. You shared what you brought. You ate, you repaired, you slept. But the rest wasn't just about you. It was part of a cycle. If one group had exerted themselves, another covered the fire that night. If someone limped in with a bruised ankle, someone else brought them meat. Sleep wasn't selfish. It was shared recovery. That's the part we forget now. We think of rest as private, as individual, but back then, it was communal. It didn't belong to you alone. It was a thread in the group's pattern, adjusted, respected, and given room to breathe. If the hunt was coming, the group slept early. If a storm was overhead, they stayed up together. If someone was missing, sleep didn't come easily to anyone. Because when you move through life as a band, sleep becomes something you protect, not just for yourself, but for the people you rely on. Someone always stayed up. Not every night. Not always the same person, but someone. You could call them a guard, a sentry, maybe even a night shift. But the truth is, they were more than that. They were the firekeeper, the one who sat at the edge of the sleeping circle and kept the flame alive, not just for warmth, but for everything it represented. Safety, memory, life continuing. They weren't chosen in a ceremony. There was no title passed down. But over time, certain people took to the role. A teenager who didn't fall asleep easily. An elder who woke often anyway. A nursing mother whose baby stirred through the night. Whoever it was, they learned the rhythm of flame and shadow. They knew which wood burned slowest, which bark sparked too fast. which wind meant trouble. They sat with the fire like it was an old companion. Sometimes they hummed softly. Sometimes they just listened to insects, to breath, to silence, stretching between trees. It wasn't a loud job, it was an attentive one. You didn't just watch for predators, you watched the fire's mood. If it flared too high, you pulled it back. If it dimmed too low, you gave it breath. There was skill in it, a craft passed down without words. And while others slept, the firekeeper thought, not always in words, more often in feeling. They reviewed the day. The meat hung to dry. The argument between cousins. The tracks found near the river. The dream someone shared the night before. It all turned slowly in their mind, softened by flame. In the stillness, they weren't just keeping watch, they were remembering and shaping the stories that might be told tomorrow. Sometimes their solitude didn't last. Another would rise, sit down without speaking, share the quiet, maybe pass a carved object between them, maybe just stare into the coals together. This wasn't small talk. This was companionship in its oldest form. I'm here too. No need to fill the silence. The fire did that on its own. And eventually, their shift ended. The fire would be stable. The embers tucked under ash to keep them hot. A glance toward the sleeping bodies. A deep breath. And then they'd curl down themselves, trusting that someone else would rise later. Maybe not right away, maybe not for an hour, but they would. Because this group was a circle, and the night passed through it like a quiet agreement. To be the firekeeper wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with applause. But it was a kind of sacred role, a moment where one person held the warmth of the group, protected it, and then let it go. It was a job built not on strength, but on trust. And somehow, even 40,000 years ago, that trust was already ancient. Before there were ceilings, there was the sky. For tens of thousands of years, when the fire burned low and eyelids fell heavy, the last thing most people saw each night wasn't drywall, it was stars, spread out above them like dust, flickering, turning, returning. The sky wasn't separate from sleep. It was part of it. A kind of celestial roof that shifted slowly across the hours. A silent witness to every breath taken in the dark. Early humans didn't have telescopes, but they had time. Time to watch. Time to notice which stars rose first, which ones trailed behind. Time to see the difference between a star that sat still and one that moved. The moon pulled shadows across their shelters. Venus glowed just before dawn, and none of this needed to be named to be known. People didn't need to map the constellations to feel their rhythm. They felt it in their bones. The stars told stories, even if the stories didn't survive. Shapes appeared in them. Hunters, birds, fires, spirits. Not as fantasy, but as reminders. People slept under the same sky, night after night. And that repetition shaped memory. That bright one marks the cold season. When those two rise together, the animals move west. The sky was a calendar, a clock, a myth, a teacher. And when sleep took over, it stayed in the background, a quiet presence humming above the firelight. Moonlight mattered too. On full moon nights, everything changed. The world was brighter, shadows longer. Hunts could happen after sunset. So could dances, or rituals. People stayed up longer. Children played in the glow. And when they finally lay down to sleep, their dreams were different, sharper, louder. Maybe it was the brightness filtering through their closed eyes. Maybe it was the electricity in the group, something unspoken that traveled from person to person, sparked by silver light. On moonless nights, everything closed in. The fire seemed more important. Voices were quieter. People curled in tighter. The darkness wasn't frightening. Not always, but it was heavy. And in that heavy dark, the stars became even more brilliant. No city haze, no artificial glare, just the raw night unfolding above them. Some nights, clouds would roll in and hide it all, and maybe that too meant something. A a sky gone blank, a night with no map. There's something beautiful in the idea that people slept under the open sky. Not because they had to, but because it wasn't strange. There was no fear in it, no separation between themselves and the air above them. They weren't worried about the stars falling. They were part of the same system, breathing under the same sky. Eyes closed, mind wandering, with a canopy that had watched them for generations. And maybe that's why we still find peace in looking up at campfires, through skylights, on long drives at night. Maybe that urge to stargaze isn't poetic, maybe it's ancient. A leftover instinct reminding us that long before we fell asleep to the glow of screens, we used to fall asleep watching the slow dance of stars. Before the mind could wander, the body had to settle. And for early humans, settling into sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a need that arrived like gravity. After a day of walking, climbing, digging, lifting, crouching, pulling, scraping, carrying, the body didn't ask permission to rest. It simply began to slow. Muscles went heavy. Joints ached in quiet places. Breaths deepened. There wasn't a bedtime routine. There was just readiness. Sleep began in the limbs. First the legs, used all day, always in motion, found stillness. Then the back softened, curving naturally against whatever surface offered the least resistance. Mats of grass, bundles of fur, sometimes earth, sometimes woven reeds. The neck stretched long, the hands relaxed. It wasn't about comfort in a modern sense. It was about release. The body, used completely, could finally go still. Sometimes there was pain, a bruise from a fall, a cut from flint, a stiff joint from the cold. But even pain had its rhythm, the kind you accepted, the kind you breathed around. There were no painkillers, no hot water bottles, just warmth, fire, and stillness. Someone might shift positions, pull a hide tighter around a sore knee, nestle into a hollow of leaves to cradle a swollen ankle. You didn't sleep despite the pain. You slept with it. You'd feel the air before you fell asleep. Not HVAC-controlled air, but real air, cold or humid or sharp with altitude. Wind slipping through a flap in the hide, the smell of smoke rising into your hair, the scent of bodies, not offensive, just present. Skin, ash, sweat, herbs, the smell of people who had been moving together all day. There were no sheets to change, no soaps to choose from, just contact, just warmth, just breathing. And the weight of the day didn't just vanish. It pressed down slowly, a good pressure. You could feel where you'd carried a basket too long, where your shoulder had strained pulling up a child or dragging a kill across the slope. But it wasn't exhaustion like we know it now. Mental, anxious, spiraling. It was earned fatigue. Satisfying, familiar. Like gravity reminding you that you'd done enough for one sun. People slept in bundles. Sometimes tangled. Sometimes loosely spaced. Children climbed on top of parents. Friends shared a hide. A foot might rest against someone's shin. A head might be on someone's stomach. There were no rules, just needs. Whoever needed the most warmth got it. Whoever was small fit wherever they could. Touch wasn't a boundary. It was a blanket. And eventually, the body let go. Breath evened out. Muscles released what tension was left. The fire flickered behind closed eyes. And the body, no longer guarding, no longer working, became a part of the earth again. Not fighting gravity, surrendering to it. Sleep wasn't escape. It was return, without books, without notes, without any form of written language. Memory wasn't just useful, it was critical. If you didn't remember where the waterhole dried up in summer, or which root turned bitter after the rains, or which animal's track looked almost like another's, you could die. And so early humans became masters of memory. But they didn't cram facts, they lived them. And sleep was the tool that locked it all in. Modern science tells us what early humans never had to explain. The brain consolidates memory while we sleep. That's when it sorts through the noise, strengthens patterns, stores the useful stuff. But even without knowing the biology, our ancestors used it. They spent their days moving, watching, learning, and their nights letting it all settle into place. Picture a young girl spending the afternoon with her aunt, learning how to strip bark from a tree without killing it. She watches the process, mimics the grip, asks no questions but remembers every gesture. That night she falls asleep, pressed between her cousin and her brother, the day still echoing in her fingers. The next morning, without thinking, her hands move the right way, not perfectly, but better, and it keeps getting better each day. That's sleep doing its quiet work. Sleep wasn't a break from learning. It was part of it. The repetition of movement, of stories, of faces and routes, all soaked into the body through use, then hardened in memory by night. Someone who'd followed a new trail during the day might wake with an internal map stitched more tightly than before. Someone who heard a story twice before sleeping might remember every word by morning, not because they studied, because they slept near the sound of it. And it wasn't just about tasks. Memory also held relationships. Who was trusted? Who had lied? Who gave generously? Who walked too close to the edge? The brain tracked it all, not to gossip, but to survive. And during sleep, those impressions sorted themselves. You woke with gut feelings, instincts, sudden clarity about something you hadn't been able to name. Don't follow him tomorrow. Try the other path. She looked afraid when he spoke. That wasn't magic. That was memory, shaped by the dark. This kind of knowing wasn't solitary. It wasn't one genius remembering everything. It was distributed. One person remembered the stars, another, the roots, someone else, the animal calls. Together they formed a living archive, and sleep helped maintain it. In rest, the group preserved its memory, not locked in objects, but in the people themselves. Even stories, the ones about the first fire, or the animal who stole the river, weren't just tales. They were containers for knowledge. You remembered the moral because you remembered the rhythm. You remembered the rhythm because you heard it before bed, when your mind was soft and your defenses were low. And slowly you carried the past forward, not just as memory, but as guidance. At some point, no one knows exactly when, someone sat near the fire, cleared their throat, and spoke just a little differently, slower, with rhythm. Maybe the words came with a beat. Maybe they followed a pattern that felt like walking. Maybe it wasn't even a full story yet, just a piece of one. But someone listened, and then someone else. And by the end of it, the group was quiet, not asleep, just still, listening not with their ears, but with their whole body. Storytelling didn't begin as performance. It wasn't about applause or teaching a lesson. It was about connection, filling the time between eating and sleeping with something that made sense of the world, something that wrapped up the chaos of the day into a shape you could carry, a shape you could dream with. Stories were never just told, they were shared. They came in all forms. Some were myths, huge and strange and beautiful. Others were smaller, like remembered events, or warnings, or jokes told the same way every time. Some were wordless, mimed, danced, acted out in front of children who didn't know the words yet. A growl for the bear, a whisper for the river, a pause for the part where someone disappears. These stories lived not in books, but in bodies, passed through movement, through voices, through memory sealed in breath. And at night, after a long day, when the fire popped and the wind died down, people leaned in. The smallest ones curled into their parents' sides. The elders watched the flames. The storyteller spoke low. No need to raise a voice. The night itself was listening. And this was more than entertainment. It was identity. It was how you knew what kind of people you were. There were rules, but not strict ones. Some stories belonged to certain voices. Some were only told in winter. Some were never to be spoken when someone was sick or pregnant or newly grieving. Others were told every night for a week straight because a child couldn't get enough of it, and everyone else indulged them. because repeating a story was how it grew roots. And these weren't stories you wrote down. They were stories you slept near. That was part of the ritual. You'd hear the tale, feel your eyes close, drift off halfway through, then hear it again the next night. Eventually, the words lived in your dreams. The characters became yours. You didn't memorize the story. The story memorized you. By the time you could tell it yourself, you didn't even realize you'd learned it. It came out of your mouth in the same rhythm, the same pauses, the same inflections, like it had been waiting there all along. That was the real inheritance. Not tools, not food, not shelter, but story, woven into sleep, passed through the flame, carried across generations by tired voices and listening hearts. Not every night was calm. The earth didn't wait for the people around the fire to finish their story. Sometimes it rained. Sometimes it poured. Sometimes the wind came screaming down the valley with no warning at all. And when that happened, the group didn't panic. They adjusted. Survival in the Paleolithic wasn't about domination. It was about reading the signs and knowing how to sleep through them. Shelters were simple but smart. In places with frequent storms, they were tucked under overhangs or built low to the ground to avoid collapse. Woven branches, heavy hides, packed earth. People knew how to weigh down the corners so they wouldn't lift in the wind. They built fire pits that drained, used moss for insulation, angled the entrance away from where the rain came. These weren't crude camps. They were evolving designs, shaped by memory and necessity. When storms hit at night, sleep didn't stop, but it changed. People shifted inward, pressed together. The fire would be fed more often. Whoever was nearest kept it going, even if it meant using the driest bark left in the pouch. Steam might rise off cloaks. Water might drip in from a seam they hadn't patched well enough. A child might cry, and someone would press their forehead to theirs, whisper something low, something rhythmic, until the breath settled. The sounds of weather became part of the night's rhythm. The drumming of rain on hide, the wind moaning through trees, thunder echoing far off and coming closer. Sometimes it shook the ground. Sometimes it felt like the world was coming undone. But inside the circle, people held each other tighter. Not from fear exactly, but from instinct. You lean in when the world leans hard. And there was beauty too. After the worst of the storm passed, when the wind died and the dripping slowed, the air smelled cleaner. Everything felt washed. The fire hissed with dampness, but glowed strong. And the people still breathing in that small space, still warm, still there, felt like a miracle. Like the storm had tested the shelter, the group, the fire, and everything had held. In cold seasons, the nights were even more demanding. Sleep came quickly, the body conserving heat. But getting comfortable was harder. Furs were shared. Stones heated in the fire were wrapped and placed near feet. People sometimes slept in layers, not because they had a wardrobe, but because they had each other. Sleeping alone in winter was dangerous. Sleeping with the weather didn't care about comfort. But humans weren't just enduring the elements, they were learning from them. With every soaked shelter, every burnt flap, every bitter frost, they got smarter. And the nights they survived together became part of the group's deep memory, not as trauma, but as proof we made it. We knew when to move, when to stay, when to lean in, and let the storm pass. Sleep didn't always wait for night. If the sun was high, the camp quiet, and the belly full, someone, or many someones, would close their eyes. There wasn't a word for nap. No schedule, no guilt. Just an understanding that if your body asked to rest, you let it. Day sleep wasn't failure. It was part of the rhythm. Picture the midday heat pressing down on a small clearing. The foragers have returned, baskets half full, some laughter in the air, someone's sharpening a blade, someone else is chewing roots. But off to the side, lying on their back with a palm across their chest, an elder is asleep. No blanket, no ceremony, just stillness. No one scolds, no one teases. If anything, They lower their voices. That nap isn't laziness. It's recovery. It's wisdom. Children napped all the time, and no one tried to train it out of them. They dropped wherever they felt safe, in a lap, against a sibling's shoulder, under the shade of a hide. Some woke quickly. Some slept so hard you'd think they were dreaming the first stories ever told, and they always woke into the same world, one that didn't rush them, didn't shame them for needing a break. They learned early that sleep was welcome. Even adults napped in brief, stolen ways, between tasks, after a long walk, while sitting upright with a tool still in hand. The group's safety net allowed it. When everyone is watching, no one has to stay alert all the time. One person might doze while another keeps an eye on the horizon. Then they switch. No announcements, just small unspoken exchanges of trust. Sometimes napping happened in pairs. Two people lying side by side, heads tilted in opposite directions, maybe talking softly until the words fade into breath. These weren't deep sleeps, more like drifts, a few minutes of surrender. The kind of rest you can only take when you know someone else is holding the line. And after intense effort, after a hunt, after building a shelter, after hours of scraping a hide, day sleep became ritual, a full-body exhale. You didn't fight it. You didn't push through. You lay down with the work still on your hands and let the heat of the earth pull you down for a little while, just enough to reset, to soften, to be quiet again. There was no badge for skipping sleep, no pride in exhaustion. That's a modern myth. Back then, rest was woven into the day like water, like breath, taken when needed, shared when possible, honored without needing a reason. Because in a world where survival depended on awareness, strength, and memory, rest wasn't optional. It was strategy. Sleep had two halves, the soft sinking of the body and the strange climbing of the mind. Dreams came without warning, sometimes vivid, sometimes scattered, sometimes so real they haunted a person for days. Early humans didn't separate dreams from life. They didn't dismiss them. They listened. A dream could be anything: a conversation with someone already gone, a journey to a place you'd never seen, an animal speaking in a human voice, a fire that never burned out. These weren't just nighttime tricks of the brain. They were events, things that happened and mattered. People woke up remembering them in detail, and then they shared. Not with everyone. Some dreams were kept close, whispered to a sibling or a grandmother. Others were spoken aloud to the entire group, especially if they felt like a warning. I saw the river vanish. I saw too many bones in the clearing. I saw the child with no face. You didn't need to understand the meaning to know it meant something. Dreamers were watched a little closer. Their moods mattered more that day. There might have been dream interpreters, not priests, but people known for insight. Not always the loudest voice, sometimes the quietest. Someone who could hear a strange dream and say, "Wait, you're not the only one who's seen that." Not an answer, but a bridge, a shared thread. Some groups may have even believed certain people could cross between waking and dreaming on purpose. Seers, vision keepers. Whatever the word was, it came with respect. Sometimes dreams shaped behavior. A hunter might refuse to track a certain animal after dreaming of its death. A parent might carry a stone shaped like something from their dream, not as superstition, but as memory. A talisman made from clay or bone, not to control the dream, but to remember its weight, because forgetting a dream was like losing a message that had been sent to you. And then there were the dreams that changed a person. Not because they made sense, but because they didn't. Someone might wake in silence, go about their day slower, softer, their eyes distant. The group would notice, but wouldn't press. That too was part of the rhythm. Some dreams needed time. You couldn't explain them while the ashes were still warm. We still dream, but we rarely treat those dreams with the same care. Maybe because our world is too full, too fast. But back then, when the stars watched from above and the fire pulsed beside you, dreams didn't need interpretation to matter. They were part of being alive. part of sleeping beside people who would listen when you said, "I saw something last night, and I think it was real." The dark was not empty. It was full of sound, movement, possibility. For early humans, night didn't just bring stars and stories. It brought risk. Not every night, but often enough to matter. A low growl in the distance, a rustle where no one was walking. Eyes reflecting light, too high or too wide to belong to anyone from the group. The dark wasn't evil, but it demanded attention. People weren't helpless in the face of night, but they were honest about it. They knew that darkness could hide a predator, a snake, a rival band, a sudden drop. There was no need to pretend they weren't afraid. Fear wasn't shameful. It was useful. It kept the fire burning, kept the group close, kept the spears within reach. Even while they slept, the fire wasn't just warmth. It was defense. Light. Boundary. Animals didn't like it. Most stayed away. And that glowing center became more than just flame. It was home base, safe zone. The further you drifted from it, the more your heartbeat changed. Everyone learned early how far you could wander before the fire felt too small behind you. And sometimes, someone tested that edge. A child, a curious teen, and they always came back fast, breathing quick, eyes wide. There were sounds you could explain. Owls, frogs, the creak of bark cooling in the air. But there were others you couldn't. And people didn't pretend otherwise. Sometimes, something moved in the trees, and everyone went silent. Spears were picked up without a word. Fire was stirred. Faces turned toward the sound. And after a few long breaths, if nothing came, someone might laugh softly, just enough to let the fear ease out, not dismiss it, just to release the pressure. Fear didn't isolate people. It brought them closer. You didn't sit apart on nights like that. You curled in tighter. You reached for a hand. You watched each other's faces, waiting for someone, anyone to say, "It's okay." And sometimes it was the elders who calmed the group. Not by denying the fear, but by knowing how to hold it. That sound, it's always there when the moon is low. I heard it when I was your age. It doesn't come near fire. And then came the stories. Fear invited stories in a different way. Not playful ones, not myths about clever foxes, but deeper ones about spirits in the dark, about voices that called out and shouldn't be answered. These tales weren't told to scare. They were told to mark the line between safety and danger. And somehow naming the fear made it easier to sleep. It gave the dark shape. So yes, the nights could be frightening, but they were never faced alone. Fear was handled as a group, felt together, answered together. And maybe that's what made sleep possible, even on the worst nights. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of others. Watching with you, listening, waiting, breathing. Every day ended a little differently. The weather changed. The food was different. Someone was missing, or someone had returned. But sleep still came. And before it did, there were rituals. Not written ones, not rehearsed, but quiet patterns that repeated over and over, smoothing the transition from waking into sleep. You didn't need instructions. You just watched and you learned. Someone always stretched out by the fire. That was usually first, not dramatically, just a long sigh, arms overhead, back cracking softly. Others followed. One person took a last drink from the water pouch. Another poked the fire a few more times to make sure it would last. Someone folded a piece of hide, tucking it under their head. These small gestures weren't discussed. They were signals. You might see a mother, slowly braiding a daughter's hair by firelight. Not for beauty, for practicality. To keep the strands from tangling in sleep, the child leans in, eyelids heavy, the rhythm of fingers on scalp almost hypnotic. Somewhere else, an elder is rubbing a sore knee with warmed animal fat. A young man sharpens his flint tool one last time. Not because he needs it now, but because it brings him stillness. These are the final acts of the day. Private, familiar, anchoring. There was no need to rush. That's one thing we've lost. Nobody in the Paleolithic world was checking a screen, counting hours until a meeting, watching the clock tick down on a countdown app. If anything, the body was the clock. And when the light dimmed and the stories were done, people moved into rest like stones settling into sand. The group adjusted naturally. Whoever needed to be on the outside, maybe someone who ran hot or wanted to keep an eye out, lay near the entrance, smaller bodies curled into the middle, arms found arms, legs tangled without thought. Some people fell asleep instantly. Others needed time. They would listen to the fire, to the wind, to the whisper of a nearby sleeper's breath, until the rhythm pulled them under. Some might hum softly, no lyrics, just a tone, a breath moving through the nose, carried on memory. Maybe a mother to a baby, maybe to herself. Repetition did what it always does. It soothed. Whether it was a gesture, a sound, a breath, or a pressure against the ground, people found rituals of release that helped their bodies let go. That signaled, the day is over. You've done enough. Rest now. And so the group dimmed like the fire. Slowly, unevenly. A flicker here. A soft sigh there. Until everyone was quiet. Until even the watchers, even the cautious ones, had shifted from alertness into that early stage of letting go. No fanfare. Just breath and bone and skin against skin. Not a bedtime. A surrender. The earth has its own rhythm. And early humans moved to it like muscle to heartbeat. They didn't name it circadian or seasonal. They just felt it. Winter meant longer nights, slower mornings. Summer meant short sleep and early light. Everything changed with the sky, and so did rest. In the colder months, people slept more. Not by choice, but because there wasn't much else to do after dark. The sun dipped low early, and the temperature dropped fast. Fires were fed longer. People stayed close. There was more silence. Sleep came not in a rush, but in layers, like the furs they wrapped around themselves. Not one long stretch, but broken into pieces. Drift off, wake, shift position, stare at the fire, drift again. This wasn't a flaw. It was a pattern. 2-part sleep was common, even natural. One stretch after nightfall. A waking in the middle, often called the watch. Then a second sleep until dawn. During that middle time, people sometimes talked, whispered, tended the fire, sat in silence. Some made love. Some meditated without calling it that. Some reflected on dreams. This gap between sleeps became a kind of breathing room, a pause in the long night that didn't demand anything but awareness. In warmer months, sleep was shorter but deeper. The days were full, demanding, endless, movement, hunting, fishing, gathering, digging, repairing, and when night came, it was short, just enough to recover. People didn't fight for 8 hours. They lay down when it was time and woke up with the birds. There wasn't a debate about it. The body followed the sun. Summer sleep often happened outside the shelter, under stars, closer to the edge of the camp where breezes moved more freely. The smell of herbs, the sound of insects. Sometimes sleep was interrupted by heat, by storms, by the restless shifting of bodies too warm to stay still. But no one saw this as poor sleep, just different sleep. Summer sleep was fast and forgiving. The seasons shaped more than temperature. They shaped how close people slept. In winter, tight bundles. In summer, loose scatterings. In winter, silence ruled. In summer, quiet murmuring. Sometimes laughter, even after the fire burned down. Each season had its mood, and people matched it. They didn't sleep the same way all year. They didn't expect to. This wasn't a flaw in their biology. It was the mark of adaptation. People listened, not to a lecture, but to their own breath, their hunger, their skin against the air. They didn't ask, "Am I sleeping right?" They asked nothing at all. They simply lived in sync with the turning earth, letting their bodies drift in and out of rest like tides on stone. Sleep changed when a child was born. That truth is older than language, no matter the time or place. Once an infant arrived, the shape of rest shifted. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a surprise. It was simply understood. The child needed more, and the parent would have less. But the sacrifice wasn't silent or lonely. In Paleolithic life, where everything was shared, fire, food, space, water, the work of raising a child belonged to everyone. Mothers never slept apart from their babies. Not in a separate room, not in a different corner of the shelter. The infant was kept skin to skin, warm under hides, resting on chests or nestled between thighs, sometimes bound to the hip with animal fiber. Crying wasn't a disruption, it was a pulse, a sign that breath was still moving. Someone always responded, usually the mother, but often a sister, an aunt, a grandmother, someone who had known what it meant to wake in the middle of the night, not in frustration, but in familiar duty. Feeding happened on demand, if you could even call it that. There was no concept of a schedule, no journals to track ounces, no battle to return the child to sleep. If they stirred, they were fed. If they cried, they were rocked. The line between waking and sleeping blurred. A mother might drift in and out with her child still at the breast, both of them curled around the hum of the fire. There was no clock, no judgment, only the presence of need and the gentle, practiced answer to it. The rest of the group adjusted. If the infant cried loud enough to stir the whole circle, no one cursed, no one scolded. A hunter might roll to the other side, tucking his head beneath a folded skin. A tired elder might grunt, shift, and return to sleep. But no one blamed the child. Children weren't nuisances. They were living proof that the world was still working. Their needs were not interruptions. They were centerpieces. As children grew, sleep changed again. Toddlers collapsed mid-play, stone toy still clutched in hand. They fell asleep during stories, heads resting in someone's lap. They were moved gently, never woken unless necessary. Sleep didn't happen in bedrooms. It happened wherever there was breath and softness, against shoulders, on thighs, near the fire, under the stars. And if a child cried from fear, a bad dream, a shadow outside, someone always pulled them close. It didn't matter whose child it was. Often it was the elders who stirred first. Their sleep was light, trained by age. They'd rise before the mother did, sensing a change in the air, a whimper in the dark. They didn't see it as work. They didn't need to be asked. They had already raised children. Their bodies remembered what it meant to respond to the soft sounds of distress. Their touch was steady, their hands soothed without fuss. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They just showed up. Fathers played their part too, not in some modern redefinition of roles, but in the old way, carrying, guarding, rocking, comforting. If the mother was bone-tired, someone else took the child for a while. If she needed to gather roots, another hand held the child. No badge, no announcement, no applause, just function. That was the strength of a small group. No one had to do everything alone. And because sleep was so vital, because a single bad night could echo into weakness the next day, people helped however they could. The nights were not always easy. There were long, sleepless hours of fever, teething, coughing, restlessness. But these weren't lonely vigils. The fire always burned. Someone else was always nearby. Even when exhausted, the parent wasn't isolated. And when the baby finally slept, when that long breath came, when the whole circle exhaled with it, it wasn't just relief, it was communion, a small return to stillness. And for a little while, the world became quiet again. As the body aged, so did its rhythms. Sleep changed, not in a broken way, but in a different one. Elders didn't sleep as deeply or as long. They woke earlier. They heard things the others missed. And far from being seen as a problem, this shift in rest made them vital. In the Paleolithic world, an elder wasn't just a storyteller or memory keeper. They were the night's quiet watch. An older man might be the first to stir after the first sleep. He wouldn't speak. Just rise, stoke the fire, check the edges of the shelter, maybe stretch his back against a tree trunk, rub warmth into his knees. He wasn't guarding in the strict sense, but he was present, awake while others slept. That presence, that awareness, it gave the group safety without words. Sometimes, two elders shared that middle watch. They might speak softly, not in full conversations, but in fragments. Did you hear the owl? The air's colder than yesterday. I saw her dreaming. Then they'd fall silent again. Not every night needed words. Sometimes it was enough to sit beside the flames and listen to the wind moving through the branches. They remembered the years when they held infants in the dark, when their joints didn't ache, when they could run, lift, carry, scrape, hunt. But they didn't long for it. The body had changed, yes, but the mind had grown deeper. They knew what it meant when someone shifted in sleep. They knew which dreams meant fear and which meant hunger. They knew how to stay quiet, how to be still without sleeping. Younger members of the group might not have noticed, but their rest was safer because of that silent attention. If a child stirred, an elder often reached them first. If someone cried out in a dream, it was the elder who offered a hand before they fully woke. There was no hesitation, just movement, quiet, practiced, unfussy. These weren't caretakers, they were anchors. Their own sleep came in fragments, a short rest after dusk, a deeper doze in the early hours. Sometimes they napped in the sun, face turned up, mouth slightly open. They didn't need explanations. They followed the body's wisdom. Rest when tired, rise when needed. No alarms, no sleep hygiene. Just a slow, ancient trust in the rhythm that had carried them this far. And in the morning, when others blinked awake and stretched against the day, it was often the elders who had already been watching the sky, already fed the fire, already knew what the wind smelled like. Their sleep was less, but their awareness was more. They weren't fading, they were shifting. And the night, in all its silence, made room for them. Not every night was peaceful. Some came after loss. A child who didn't survive the winter, a hunter who never returned, a fever that slipped into the camp and took someone too fast. When someone died, the night changed. Sleep didn't come easily, not because of noise, but because of absence, the missing breath. The space where a body used to rest, that hollow was louder than any storm. In the first nights after a death, the group slept differently, more tightly, as if to close the gap left behind. There was often silence, not the usual restful hush, but a dense, heavy quiet. No humming, no stories. The fire was fed but not stared into. People lay down earlier or much later. No one needed to say why. Everyone already knew. Sleep became thin and cautious, like it might break under the weight of memory. Some cried softly under hides. Others stared into the dark for hours, unmoving. But no one cried alone. Grief wasn't hidden behind walls. It sat in the circle with everyone else. Sometimes an elder would sing, not for comfort, but to carry the weight. A low, breathy tune. No words, just tone. Something between a lullaby and a morning call. Not to stop the pain, just to keep it company. In some groups, tokens were placed beside the fire for the dead. A bone carved with care, a feather, a stone smoothed by the river. Sometimes the space where they used to sleep was left undisturbed for days. No one lay there, no one asked to. It stayed warm with memory, a visible absence, and eventually, slowly, someone would move closer. Not to erase, but to continue. Dreams became intense after loss. People dreamed of the one who was gone, not just as a shadow, but whole, speaking, laughing, turning to leave again. These dreams were shared the next morning, voice trembling, or not shared at all, just held in the chest. Sometimes the dream was seen as a message, sometimes just as longing. Either way, It deepened the wound in a way that made it real, and gave it room to breathe. Sleep did return. Not all at once, and never exactly the same. But it came first in short stretches, then longer ones. The grief didn't leave. It just folded itself into the night, into the way someone stirred when the fire popped, into the stories told weeks later, when someone finally had the strength to say their name out loud again. Loss was permanent, but so was the group. And together, they learned how to rest beside sorrow. That was part of survival too. Not just feeding, not just hunting, but mourning without retreating, letting grief take its shape, while the fire kept burning, and the circle stayed whole. Even in the face of death, people still slept, not because they forgot, but because they remembered. Night wasn't silent. It never had been. Even when every voice in the shelter had gone quiet, the world still spoke, a constant conversation. Not loud, not urgent, but alive. And for people who lived without glass windows, without thick walls or machines to fill the space, those sounds were not background noise. They were part of sleep itself. Close by, there was the fire. Always the fire. Its breath, its crackle, the tiny hiss when damp wood caught flame, the rhythm of it, the way it rose and fell like a person exhaling, a calming sound, but not without personality. Sometimes it snapped so sharply, it woke someone. Sometimes it murmured so low it almost faded, but it was never still. And as long as it was there, sleep felt possible. Then there was the wind. Not always strong, not always cold, but present. Moving through grasses, shaking leaves, slipping through the smallest cracks in the shelter. Some nights it howled. Some nights it whistled. Some nights it touched your skin just lightly enough to feel like a memory. People listened without thinking. They judged its direction, its strength. Not out of fear, but out of familiarity. Wind was something you knew, like a relative who visited often. Beyond that, the world was full of voices not your own. Frogs in the reeds, crickets in the brush, owls calling back and forth in long loops of sound, the occasional rustle, a badger maybe, a wild dog. Most nights, these didn't bring alarm. They were expected, known. Their patterns were part of the map the brain made in the dark. Anything too new, too loud, too still. That's when ears perked up, when breath held for just a second too long. Sometimes there were human sounds too. A sleeper murmuring mid-dream, a cough, the soft shuffle of someone shifting position, the wet sound of a baby nursing, someone breathing heavily near the edge of sleep but not yet fully gone. These weren't intrusions, they were reminders. You weren't alone. That body, that sound, it meant safety. It meant presence. It meant you could let go a little more. And once in a while, someone would hum. Not loud, and not for long. Just a few tones rising out of half-sleep. A song without shape. A habit left over from childhood. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe not. But it threaded itself into the air and settled there, low and slow, until it disappeared. People remembered it without realizing that hum might show up in someone else's sleep later, folded into a dream. The night was a living thing, not silent, not threatening, just rich, full of tone and pattern and texture. And those sounds, the ones closest to the skin and the ones far out in the dark, they shaped the edges of sleep. They told the body where it was, who was near, what was safe. And so the group drifted off each night, not into silence, but into sound. The ground wasn't just where you walked, it was where you lay. Where you curled your spine, rested your skull, pressed your body down at the end of each day. Sleep didn't come on a mattress or cushion. It came on earth, layered, softened, made just comfortable enough by hands that knew what mattered. And while it may not sound like comfort to us now, it was more than enough then. People didn't just drop to the bare dirt. They built their beds with care. Grass was gathered, long, dry, soft to the touch, laid down in layers, sometimes woven into mats, sometimes placed over bark, or shallow hollows scooped out to cradle a hip or shoulder. On top of that came hides, tanned, flexible, warming. The feel of fur against skin wasn't luxury. It was necessity, especially in the colder months. The earth was uneven, but people learned how to shape it. They knew which corners of the shelter stayed driest, where the wind slid under the walls. They moved often, but they always recreated the same patterns: soft ground, layered bedding, shared warmth. There was no one-size-fits-all sleeping place. Everyone had their own spot, even if it shifted slightly each night. Sometimes a spot closer to the fire, sometimes farther, depending on the season, the need, the day's wait. And always, there was contact. People didn't sleep far apart. They slept with shoulders touching, backs pressed together, arms tangled. This wasn't awkward. It was instinct. Warmth mattered. So did closeness, especially in families, or among people who had walked together for a long time. Sleep was another way of saying, I'm here, I've got you. You're not alone tonight. Children especially slept against someone. Even when they were old enough to walk on their own, they crawled into hides already occupied. Their small bodies curved against thighs, chests, curled into ribs. They were carried into sleep. And when they woke with dreams or discomfort, they reached for the same familiar shapes. Adults didn't flinch from this. They expected it. They welcomed it. That small seeking hand meant something in the dark. Not all touches were restful. Sometimes sleep came after a fight, after a tense day, and people lay stiffly beside each other, not speaking. But even then, the group slept together. Solitude in sleep was rare. If someone moved too far from the fire, someone else noticed. Maybe not with words, but with a shift, a glance, a gentle gesture. Touch was language, and it meant more in the dark. Over time, the bedding itself took on memory. Hides grew worn in certain places. Mats softened. The ground under them shaped itself to repeated pressure. It became easier to rest there, even after a hard day. And as the firelight danced across backs and hair and closed eyes, sleep came again. Not on beds, not in silence, but on woven grass, warm hides, pressed skin, and the oldest knowledge of all, the feeling of being close to another living body. Falling asleep alone is a modern concept. For most of human history, sleep wasn't private. It wasn't an escape. It was shared territory. The body might drift, but the bond with the group remained. You didn't fall asleep because you shut the world out. You slept because you knew someone else was still in it, awake, watching, breathing beside you. Trust lived at the center of the night. Not spoken out loud, but felt in every gesture. The weight of a shoulder against yours. The warmth of someone's ankle tucked behind your calf. The rustle of movement nearby that didn't startle you because you knew the rhythm of that breath. The group's presence allowed you to surrender to sleep. No locks, no fences, just proximity and history, and 1,000 small signs that meant you are safe. Every group had its own pattern. Some slept in tight circles, heads toward the center, feet out like petals. Others nested in rows, layers of family and closeness, arms thrown over ribs, foreheads pressed together, babies in the middle, elders near the fire. Those patterns weren't assigned. They formed over time, shaped by routine, preference, protection. You always knew who you'd sleep near, and if that changed, you knew why. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a gesture of faith. You closed your eyes, knowing someone else would stay up a little longer. Tend the fire, hear the distant crack of a twig, answer the quiet cry of a child. Roles rotated. There was no assigned night watch, just an understanding. If you happened to be awake, you paid attention. If you heard something strange, you didn't shake the whole group. You shifted closer to the edge, picked up a stone, listened longer. It wasn't heroic, it was ordinary care. This kind of sleep trained the body in quiet ways. You didn't flinch at every sound. You learned to tell difference between a fox in the grass and a heavy footstep, between a sleeper rolling over and a threat outside the shelter. Your ears didn't sleep completely. Part of you remained tuned to the group, not in fear, but in connection, like a shared heartbeat, spread across a dozen people. There was a rhythm to group sleep, even when it didn't look like it. Some people stirred after a few hours, rose to urinate by a tree, stoked the fire, muttered to themselves, lay back down. No one questioned it. Others slept straight through, still as stone. Some snored, some thrashed. The group absorbed it all. No sleep was perfect, but it was held by the warmth, by the nearness, by the mutual agreement that rest was allowed. And when someone was missing, sick, out hunting, newly gone, the group felt it. The rhythm changed. The shape of the night adjusted. Someone rolled toward the empty space and woke up colder. Someone else lay awake longer than usual, listening for a voice that wouldn't come. Even in sleep, the group felt its own edges. And somehow, that feeling of sleeping together, of surrendering without fear, was as important as any shelter or fire. It was the thing that made the wild survivable. Not every night cooperated. Sometimes, no matter how tired the body was, sleep stayed just out of reach. The fire was warm. The ground was soft. The people around you were quiet, but your eyes stayed open. Something in you stayed awake. They didn't call it insomnia. There were no names for sleep disorders, no clinics, no blue light warnings, but the experience was familiar. A restlessness in the chest. A brain that wouldn't stop replaying the day. The sound of an argument. The shadow in the trees. The strange way that animal moved before it vanished. The thoughts moved in circles. And you didn't fight them. You just got up. In a group of 30, someone else was usually awake too. Sometimes it was an elder stoking the fire. Sometimes it was a young person struggling with a nightmare. Sometimes it was a mother rocking her child for the third time since dusk. And if you rose, you weren't alone. You didn't need to explain. You sat near the flames or walked a slow circle around the edge of the shelter. You let the night hold you. Rest didn't always mean sleep. Sometimes it meant motion. Hands carving a piece of wood. Fingers weaving dry grass into a new mat. Someone whispering to themselves, not words but rhythm. The act of doing something small, something quiet, something that didn't ask too much. The fire watched. The wind moved through your hair. Eventually, your body softened again. Other times, you just listened. Not for danger, just for sound. Frogs calling to each other in the reeds. A sudden breeze stirring the trees. The deep, slow breath of the person sleeping beside you. All of it was evidence of life continuing. And sometimes, in the middle of that, sleep returned. Not like a door swinging shut, more like fog drifting in. You'd lie down again, not with expectation, but with permission. When sleep never came, it wasn't seen as failure. You weren't judged. No one asked why you looked tired the next morning. The group understood. Some nights just didn't work. Some thoughts needed time. And you'd nap later under the trees, beside the water, when the sun warmed your back and your bones couldn't fight it anymore. Sleep wasn't a rule, it was a cycle. You caught it when it came, and you waited when it didn't. And maybe that's what made sleeplessness bearable. The absence of pressure. You didn't lie awake wondering if you'd ruined your health. You didn't stare at a ceiling in silence. You simply existed inside the night, awake and unashamed, because even in wakefulness, you were still part of the group, still held by the rhythm, still carried by the ancient patience of the fire. Dreams didn't end when the sleeper woke. In the Paleolithic world, dreams traveled with people into the daylight. They shaped moods, silences, choices. Not every dream was shared, but the ones that were, those mattered, especially when they came before something important. A hunt, a move, a birth. Dreams were more than stories. They were signals. Say a hunter dreamt of a river turning red, or a great elk, but the antlers were upside down. He wouldn't ignore that. He'd tell someone, usually an elder, or someone known to understand such things, not to ask for interpretation like a puzzle, but to place the dream into the group's awareness. "I saw something strange," he might say. That was enough. The others listened. They remembered. Sometimes a dream meant a hunt was delayed, or taken in a different direction, or someone stayed behind who normally wouldn't. It wasn't about superstition. It was about observation beyond the visible, a layer of pattern beneath what the eye could see. People didn't pretend to know exactly what the dreams meant, but they didn't dismiss them either. They respected them. Dreams about animals were the most important. A predator behaving strangely, a familiar creature with unusual features. These weren't bedtime fables. They were warnings or invitations. In some groups, dreams decided which species would be hunted that week. In others, they told people when to rest, not just an individual, the entire band. "No hunting tomorrow," someone would say. The dream said to wait, and they would. There were also dreams of ancestors, people long gone, appearing in full form, sometimes silent, sometimes giving clear instructions. "Follow the birds. Move when the moon is full. Don't cross the ridge." These weren't taken lightly. And whether they were metaphors, or memories, or something else entirely, the effect was real. People listened, and sometimes that listening meant survival. Children, too, had dreams, often strange, fragmented, full of colors and animals that didn't make sense. But the group paid attention. A child might say, "I saw the cave with no end," and an elder might nod slowly. Not to confirm anything, but to make space for it. Because even young ones were connected to the pattern. Their minds hadn't yet learned to lie. What dreams meant was less important than the fact that they were honored. A dream might make someone pause on a trail, or carry an extra tool, or speak less that day. These were small changes, but they came from the same source as fire and language and art. The deep human need to make meaning, to see with eyes closed what can't yet be seen with them open. Waking wasn't sudden, not in the Paleolithic morning. There were no sharp beeps, no flashing lights, no race to begin. The return from sleep was slow, uneven, shared. One body stirred, then another. The fire had faded to red, not dead. The sky outside the shelter glowed faintly, not light yet, but no longer black. This was the edge between night and day. Someone always woke first, not by choice, just by rhythm. They shifted under the hide, propped themselves on one elbow, blinked into the ashes. No words, just breath. They listened to the wind, to the insects, to the breathing of others. Then they moved, quiet feet, careful not to step on limbs or bowls, a small stick to poke at the coals, a few dry leaves added to tease out flame. This was the first act of the day, kindling the warmth. Others followed slowly. A cough, a groan, a baby stretching with fists against the air. There were no good mornings, no rise and shine, just presence. The sense of the group returning, piece by piece. Some people sat up and stared. Others rolled over and took a few more minutes. No one barked orders. The sun wasn't up yet. There was still time. The light came gradually, filtered through trees or rock or the dome of thatched branches overhead. Eyes adjusted without effort. There was nothing to check, no messages waiting. The only question that mattered was, what does the day ask? And the answer wasn't rushed. First, people rubbed their faces, cracked their joints, took a drink from a pouch passed around, ate something, dried root, a bit of smoked meat, a handful of last night's berries. Children woke in the arms of someone older, carried into the firelight, still drowsy, heads heavy on shoulders. They weren't ordered to stand or run or wash. They were allowed to linger in that fog of half-sleep, to listen to the adults speak softly, to touch the dirt with one bare foot before putting weight on it. No one demanded alertness. It arrived when it was ready. If a task was urgent, a hunt, a long journey, people prepared. But even then, the morning unfolded with rhythm, not speed. Tools were checked, skins folded, fire tended, ladders emptied behind trees. The body wasn't dragged into movement. It returned to movement, the same way it had returned from dreaming. And once everyone was up, once voices had been heard, once firelight had flared again, once someone had laughed or cursed or cracked a joke, the night officially ended. Not with fanfare, but with life. And the day began, as it always did, from the still warm center of the night before. Once the light settled in, movement followed. Not all at once, not a burst, but a slow stretching into the world. A hand reaches for a tool. Someone pulls a fur around their shoulders and walks barefoot toward the trees. The ground is cold, but the body is used to that. Morning wasn't about comfort. It was about connection. First came the check. Were the traps still in place? Did the stream rise overnight? Had anything disturbed the storage pit? People didn't need to ask each other. The morning told them where to go. You checked what you'd prepared the day before. You noticed tracks in the mud. You crouched to sniff the wind. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was habit woven through generations. Others stayed behind. Someone tended the fire, adding dry twigs, blowing gently, coaxing the orange heart back to full flame. A child might gather the first handfuls of dry grass for kindling, learning without being taught. Someone else squatted near the embers, warming their hands before slicing meat or grinding roots. The group didn't scatter. They unfolded. There was movement, but not noise. Words were few. Voices came in low murmurs, practical things, like move that or here. A soft laugh when someone's hair stuck straight up. But most sounds were from the world itself. The buzz of insects waking up, the slap of bare feet on packed dirt, the hollow knock of stone against stone as tools were prepared. Stretching was instinctual. Arms over heads, backs arched, ankles rotated. These weren't exercises. They were just how bodies remembered to begin again. There were no warm-ups, but there was warming, slowly, from within. A tendon tugged back into length. A shoulder rolled to test its stiffness. This wasn't performance. This was function returning to form. Food wasn't eaten in one place. Someone might chew a few berries while carrying firewood. Someone else tore a strip of meat and passed it to whoever reached. There was no table. There were no rules. There was sharing and movement, and hunger answered when it called. The morning wasn't ceremonial. It was lived. By the time the sun cleared the trees and hit the shelter full on, the group was already active. Not in a frenzy, not in competition, but in rhythm. Clothes adjusted, spears checked, water gathered. Children wandered, curious and half awake, and without saying it, the camp agreed. The day had begun. Midday was not for racing, not when the sun stood overhead, hot and steady, casting short shadows and baking the ground dry. In those hours, the work slowed, the body slowed. You could fight it, but there was no reason to. Heat made everything heavier, so people stopped. Not all at once, but gradually the signs showed. Someone crouched longer than they needed to. Someone sat instead of standing. A hunter returning from the tree line rubbed the sweat off his brow and didn't go back out again. There were no rules, no whistles, no announcements. Just the shared understanding that the middle of the day was for catching your breath. People found shade, under trees, under ledges, against the cool side of a rock. Skins were spread across warm dirt. Children settled easily, tired from morning wandering, bellies full from whatever could be gathered. Sometimes they napped with their heads in someone's lap. Sometimes they fell asleep mid-chew, a fig still clutched in one hand. No one told them to lie down. They just did. Adults didn't always sleep, but they rested. Feet stretched out, eyes half-lidded, the hum of insects growing louder in the stillness. It wasn't a nap like we imagine today, scheduled and defended like a medical necessity. It was simply what the day allowed, a soft return to stillness, even if the brain stayed partly awake. just enough pause to feel the pulse return to normal. Some people did doze, especially the elders, whose sleep the night before may have been short. They'd curl onto their sides, hands tucked beneath cheeks, breath slow and dry. Others watched the clouds shift overhead, tracking the subtle drift of wind. Some passed time cleaning tools or plucking at hides. Not busy, just present. The group wasn't inactive, it was simply quiet. If someone needed water, they fetched it slowly. If someone ate, they chewed without speaking. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, just full of space. In the distance, birds called. The occasional animal moved through brush, but not quickly. Even the wild things respected the heat. For a brief moment, all of life seemed to agree. This is not the time for effort. And then, as the light began to shift, as the air thinned and the heat loosened its grip, people stirred again. Slowly at first, a shoulder stretched, a joke whispered, a fire poked. The bodies rose, not reluctantly, but patiently, ready again to move, to forage, to finish what the morning began. But for a few hours, the earth had asked them to be still, and they had listened. Evening didn't arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, like smoke rising from damp wood. The light turned golden, the air cooled, shadows lengthened, and voices grew softer. Work stopped, not because it was done, but because the body had done enough. Muscles began to ache in familiar ways. The day had offered what it would, and now it was time to return to the center of the circle. People came back in small groups, from the trees, from the stream, from wherever the day had taken them. They didn't announce themselves, just arrived, one by one, carrying stories in their faces and dirt on their skin. Someone might drop a handful of roots by the fire. Someone else carried a fish, still wet. Children came running last, noisy and half wild, but even their play began to slow. The fire became the anchor again. Flames coaxed back to life, wood stacked with care. The smoke rose and swirled, carrying with it the scent of char, of grease, of herbs crushed underfoot. This was a sacred hour, though no one called it that. It was just understood. Evening belonged to the group, not to the chase, not to the task, just to the presence of each other. Food passed hands without ceremony. Strips of meat, mashed tubers, boiled greens. Nothing fancy. Everything earned. There were no plates, no rules. Someone tore. Someone passed. Someone wiped their hands on their thighs. Laughter returned. Jokes surfaced from the quiet. The kind that only made sense to people who had shared a long walk, a hard moment, a fire for weeks at a time. And always, the fire stayed alive. Someone fed it without being asked. Someone checked the wind. Someone picked out a log that would burn slow and long into the night. The fire wasn't decoration, it was preparation. A promise that warmth would remain when the bodies gave in to sleep. The youngest drifted first. Heads fell into laps. Fingers loosened their grip on sticks and stones. No one told them to go to bed. The circle was the bed. The grass, the hides, the steady rhythm of adult voices. Sleep came easily when you weren't told to chase it. It came like gravity, simple, expected, welcome. And as night settled fully, the group drew closer. Not always in speech, but in motion. A shoulder rested on another. A foot reached out and found familiar skin. Someone yawned, and someone else answered. There were no schedules, just timing, shared and ancient. The sun was gone, the fire remained. And slowly, gently, the world prepared for sleep again. By now, the fire was lower. Its light flickered gently across closed eyes. Soft cheeks, the smooth curve of shoulders tucked beneath hides. The group had fallen into silence, not because it was required, but because nothing else needed saying. This was the quietest hour, when breath became the loudest sound, when even the insects seemed to hush. You could tell who was still awake. The slight shift of a head, a hand unconsciously scratching at skin, the slow, patient blink of someone not yet caught by dreams. but there was no pressure. Sleep came in waves, and everyone knew the body would follow soon enough. All it had to do was feel safe, and here it did. Some minds wandered before they dropped off, not in panic, just in small spirals. A memory of the stream earlier, the shape of the clouds. A joke someone made about roots that tasted like feet. There were no glowing screens to chase thoughts away, just the dark and the mind's own slow turning. You thought what you thought, and then you didn't anymore. For those still halfway there, the fire was a comfort. Its glow meant someone had tended it. Its warmth meant someone cared enough to feed it. Even with nothing left to do, that meant everything. To sleep knowing that someone, maybe not even someone you could see, had kept the center burning. That's what made unconsciousness feel like something you could trust. Babies murmured in their sleep. Older children twitched. A foot kicked. A snore started and stopped. These were all normal sounds. They didn't wake anyone. They belonged to the world of sleep, as natural as the wind moving through grass. Nothing about it needed fixing. It just needed to be allowed. The moon rose sometimes. Sometimes it didn't. Stars blinked behind thin cloud. The world didn't stop turning, but here in this circle, this moment, time didn't feel like something pressing forward. It folded back on itself, ancient and repeating. These same bodies had slept like this for tens of thousands of years. Not these exact ones, but close enough, and as sleep finally pulled the last thoughts under, the camp became whole again. No gaps, no watchers, no wanderers. Just the sound of quiet, the rhythm of breath, the pulse of warmth under fur, and the promise that tomorrow, if the fire still burned and the sun still rose, they would do it all again. Somewhere deep in the night, the world was quiet. Not silent, just full of stillness. The kind of stillness that holds everything gently. Even the fire stopped speaking so loudly. Its crackles became whispers. Its light drew softer shadows. And around it, the sleepers rested, arms tangled, breath slow, backs curved like question marks. The day was over, and sleep was here. There was no final moment. No last word before dreams. Just a slow surrender, one breath, and then another. The feeling of another body nearby. The faint scent of smoke and earth and skin, and a strange comfort in knowing the same stars that blinked above this group had blinked above others before them, and would again. If you could watch from above, you'd see it clearly. A circle of life tucked under hides and branches. No stone walls, no alarms, no locks. Just trust, warmth, fire, the oldest human architecture. And inside it, people dreaming of rivers, of animals, of songs not yet sung. Sleep wasn't separate from life. It was part of it, woven into the same thread as food, story, movement, love. There were no words for it. No one wrote it down, but it was practiced every night without fail. The rhythm of closing eyes when it was safe. The body letting go because the group would hold the rest. The fire was a heartbeat. The breath of the sleepers was wind. And the dark wasn't empty. It was familiar. So when you close your own eyes now or later, maybe you carry a little of that with you. That knowledge. That memory in the bones. That sleeping in the arms of something bigger than yourself. You may not be lying beside a fire, but some part of you still knows what it means to sleep like a human being. The old way. The deep way. And if your sleep tonight is restless, that's okay. The early humans had those nights too. But they also had something we often forget. Company. Someone to reach for in the dark. Someone to keep the fire alive. Someone to listen if you needed to speak. You are not strange for wanting that. You are ancient for it. You've been here with us for a long time now. Maybe you're still awake. Maybe you're already deep in a dream. Either way, thank you for being part of this little circle, for sitting beside the fire, even through a screen, even through time. If you ever need to return, you know where to find us. This corner of the internet isn't going anywhere. If you'd like to support more slow storytelling like this, A like or a comment helps keep the fire going. Let us know where you're listening from, what time it is, what the night feels like on your side of the world. You're not alone here. We're glad you came. And we'll see you next time when the stars return and the world is ready to fall asleep again.